Hey friends, tonight we are stepping into a small, dusty attic in the 17th century Netherlands. It is a room filled with the smell of pipe tobacco, the faint, dry scent of old paper, and the sharp, metallic tang of polished glass. We are going to sit quietly in the corner of this room and watch a man who changed the world without ever raising his voice. He sits at a wooden bench, his foot rhythmically pressing a pedal, a small wheel spinning with a hypnotic hum. He is grinding a lens, and in the precise mathematical curves of that glass, he is looking for God. His name is Baruch Spinoza, though later he will call himself Benedictus. He is a man who was expelled from his community, cursed by religious leaders, and feared by governments. Yet he lived a life of such profound gentleness and quiet dignity that even his critics were disarmed by his presence. His story is not one of battles or voyages across oceans, but a voyage into the deepest parts of the human mind. It is a story about finding calm in the middle of chaos, about using reason to quiet the storms of emotion, something I think we all search for in our modern, noisy lives. So, before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy drifting off to these stories of great minds. Let us know in the comments where you are listening from tonight, and perhaps what time it is in your corner of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The sound of the room is steady. Asterisk she. SH. Asterisk, it is the sound of abrasive sand against glass. It is a rhythm that mimics the beating of a heart or the ticking of a clock, but slower, more deliberate. In the 1660s and 70s, in the quiet towns of the Dutch Republic, Regensburg, Voorburg, and finally The Hague, this sound was the constant companion of one of history's greatest thinkers. Imagine the light in the room. It is that specific, heavy, golden light that you might recognize from the paintings of Vermeer or Rembrandt. It pours in through a leaded window, catching the millions of tiny dust motes dancing in the air. These aren't just ordinary dust motes. They are fine particles of silica, glass dust kicked up by the lathe. They hang in the air like a glittering fog. The man sitting at the bench is slight of build, with a complexion that hints at his Portuguese and Spanish ancestry, dark, intelligent eyes, black hair, and a face that often holds a faint melancholic smile. He wears a simple robe, perhaps a bit worn at the elbows, but he is always clean, always presentable. He believed that a philosopher didn't need to look like a beggar to be wise. It is not a shabby dress that makes a philosopher, he once said. He appreciated the dignity of appearance, even if his pockets were often empty. You can feel the concentration in the room. Lens grinding is not a task for the impatient. One slip of the hand, one moment of uneven pressure, and the glass is ruined, the focal point lost. It requires a complete surrender of the self to the geometry of the curve. You have to become the machine. You have to become the circle. For Spinoza, this wasn't just a way to pay the rent, though it certainly was that. It was a physical manifestation of his philosophy. He believed that the universe was governed by perfect, unchangeable laws as solid and reliable as the geometry required to focus a beam of light. As he works, his hands move with the confidence of a master craftsman. He was, by all accounts, excellent at his trade. The lenses he ground were sought after by some of the most prominent scientists of the era. Men like Christian Huygens, who was busy unraveling the secrets of Saturn's rings and the wave nature of light, would commend the plates and lenses that came from this humble attic. It is a beautiful irony, isn't it? A man who is accused of being an atheist, of being spiritually blind, was the very man crafting the tools that allowed humanity to see the physical world more clearly than ever before. Let yourself settle into the atmosphere of this workspace. There are stacks of books on the floor, heavy tomes in Latin and Hebrew. There is a small bed in the corner, narrow and Spartan. On the table, beside the grinding wheel, there is a pipe and a pouch of tobacco. Spinoza loved his pipe. He would often pause in his work, pack the bowl, and watch the smoke curl upward into the rafters, losing himself in thought. It was his small luxury, a moment of drift in a day of rigid logic. The world outside his window is bustling. The Netherlands in the 17th century is the center of global trade. Ships are arriving from the East Indies with spices that smell of nutmeg and cloves. Merchants are shouting in the stock exchange. Armies are marching across Europe. But in here, the world is reduced to a single point of focus. The abrasive sand grinds away the imperfections of the glass, just as Spinoza believed that reason could grind away the imperfections of human fear and superstition. Historians and biographers have often wondered about this choice of profession. Why did a man of such towering intellect choose manual labor that was so tedious and, frankly, dangerous? The glass dust he inhaled day after day would eventually settle in his lungs, exacerbating the lung disease like tuberculosis or silicosis that would plague his later years. Some scholars wonder if he chose it simply because it was one of the few guilds or trades that didn't require a religious oath, which, as an excommunicated man, he could not take. But others suggest something more poetic. They wonder if the grinding was a form of meditation for him. When your mind is capable of holding the entire structure of the universe, when you are constantly wrestling with the nature of infinity and the definition of God, perhaps you need something tangible to hold on to. Perhaps the simple, repetitive act of friction glass against iron, sand against crystal, was the anchor that kept him from floating away entirely. It grounded him. It reminded him that he was a body, occupying space, subject to the same laws of physics as the stars and the stones. You can imagine him pausing now, lifting the lens to the window to check its clarity. He squints one eye, looking through the glass at a tree swaying in the wind outside. The world through the lens is upside down, perhaps, or magnified, but it is clear. Clarity was his obsession. He wanted to wipe the fog from the window of the human soul. He believed that most of us live in a state of bondage. We are slaves to our emotions, to our anger, our jealousy, our hope, and our fear. We are tossed around like small boats in a storm because we do not understand the causes of our feelings. We blame others. We blame bad luck. We blame demons or angry gods. But Spinoza sat in his room and thought, no, there is no angry God. There is no bad luck. There is only cause and effect. If we can understand the geometry of our emotions, just as we understand the geometry of this lens, we can be free. It is a comforting thought to hold on to as we begin this story. The idea that everything, even the things that hurt us or confuse us, has a reason, a cause, a place in the order of things. Spinoza invites us to look at our lives, not with sorrow or anger, but with the quiet curiosity of a lens grinder looking at a piece of glass. He puts the lens down. He brushes the white dust from his robe. The sun is beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the floorboards. The room is cooling down. In the silence, you can almost hear the scratch of a quill pen on paper, because when the grinding stopped, the writing began. At night, by candlelight, he would write the books that would get him banned, books that would be circulated in secret, wrapped in brown paper, whispered about in coffee houses. But before he was the dangerous philosopher, he was just a boy. To understand how he ended up in this attic, alone but free, we have to travel back in time. We have to leave the quiet of The Hague and step into the vibrant, noisy, wet streets of Amsterdam in the 1630s. We have to meet the boy named Bento, who looked at the synagogue and the city and realized he didn't quite fit in either. The dust motes are settling now. The wheel has stopped spinning. Let's drift back to the beginning, to a city rising from the water where a young mind was about to catch fire. Word count 1180. Greater than awaiting continue. You can almost smell the salt in the air. We are drifting now, away from the quiet attic and into the damp, misty streets of 17th century Amsterdam. If you have ever walked along a canal in the early morning, you know the sound, the soft lap of water against brick, the creaking of wood, the cry of a gull circling overhead. But the Amsterdam of the 1630s was something more. It was the pulsing heart of the world. While the rest of Europe was often locked in rigid hierarchies of kings and peasants, drowning in the blood of religious wars, the Dutch Republic was different. It was a republic, a place where merchants held more power than princes. It was a swampy delta that had been drained and engineered into a miracle of commerce. They called it the Dutch Golden Age, and truly, everything seemed to turn to gold here. Imagine walking along the harbor. It is a forest of masts. Ships from the Dutch East India Company, the famous VOC, are docking, heavy in the water. They have traveled for months, rounding the Cape of Good Hope, crossing the Indian Ocean, to bring back treasures that were once the stuff of legend. The air on the docks is thick with scents that would have seemed alien to a European nose just a generation earlier. The sharp, medicinal tang of cloves, the warm sweetness of cinnamon, the biting aroma of black pepper, and the rich, earthy smell of nutmeg. These weren't just ingredients. They were wealth. They were status. In the middle of this sensory explosion, in a neighborhood known as Vloeienberg, which literally meant flood castle because it was built on reclaimed land that occasionally still felt the wet embrace of the Amstel River brook, Spinoza was born. The date was November 24th, 1632. The house he grew up in was a prominent one. His father, Michael de Spinoza, was a successful merchant, a man of standing in the community. You can picture the interior of the house. Dark wood paneling, heavy velvet drapes to keep out the damp chill of the Dutch winter, and floors polished to a shine. It was a Jewish household, but not in the way you might imagine a shtetl in Eastern Europe. This was a Portuguese Jewish home. The language spoken at the dinner table wasn't Yiddish, but Portuguese and perhaps some Spanish. This community was unique. They were the Sephardim, the people of Spain. They carried themselves with a certain aristocratic bearing. They called themselves Nakao, the nation. Even in exile, they held on to a sense of nobility. They dressed in the fashion of the Dutch burghers' black doublets, wide white collars, but their hearts beat with the rhythms of the Iberian Peninsula. Young Baruch, or Bento, as his family likely called him, both names mean blessed, one in Hebrew, one in Portuguese, grew up in a world of layers. Step outside the front door, and you are in a Dutch Calvinist city, hearing the guttural sounds of the Dutch language, seeing the steeples of the churches, and feeling the strict, industrious energy of a Protestant society. Step back inside, and you are in a world of Iberian tradition, of rich history, and of a deep, pervasive trauma that we will explore soon. It must have been a dizzying place for a child. Historians often describe Amsterdam at this time as a Babel of tongues and ideas. You could walk down a single street and hear French Huguenot refugees, English Puritans fleeing persecution, some of whom would soon sail on the Mayflower, and German laborers. It was a city of refugees. And because everyone was from somewhere else, there was a tacit agreement. We will tolerate you as long as you are good for business. This tolerance wasn't the modern idea of celebrating diversity. It was more practical. It was a tolerance born of indifference and pragmatism. The Dutch didn't necessarily like the Catholics or the Jews, but they liked peace and they liked prosperity. So they let people be. This environment, this specific cocktail of commerce and mild neglect, was the soil in which Spinoza's mind grew. Imagine little Bento running along the Houtdrecht Canal. He was a bright boy, undeniably sharp. We don't have many records of his childhood games, but human nature tells us he must have played. Perhaps he watched the barges being unloaded, fascinated by the pulleys and levers, the mechanics of trade. Even then, was he looking at the ropes and wondering about the forces of tension and gravity? Was he looking at the water and wondering why it flowed the way it did? There is a humanizing detail that survives in the margins of his later life that perhaps sheds light on his boyhood. Spinoza was known to keep spiders. Later in life, in his solitary rooms, he would sometimes catch flies and put them in the spider's web, watching the battle with an intensity that disturbed his landlords. It sounds cruel to us, but for him, it was observation. He was watching nature in its rawest form power, survival, cause, and effect. Did this fascination start here, on the damp stones of Luyenburg, watching the spiders spin their webs in the corners of the merchant warehouses? The education of a boy, like Bento, was rigorous. He didn't go to a Dutch public school. He went to the Talmud Torah, the Jewish school. Here, the air smelled of beeswax candles and old parchment. From a very young age, he sat on wooden benches, rocking back and forth, chanting the verses of the Torah in Hebrew. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim v'et ha'eretz. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. He was immersed in the text. He learned the laws, the commentaries, the infinite arguments of the rabbis. He was being groomed. His father was a leader in the synagogue. His family was respected. The expectations were heavy on his small shoulders. Everyone looked at Bento and saw a future rabbi, a pillar of the community, a light of the exile. They saw a boy who absorbed knowledge like a sponge. But there is a scholarly question that lingers over these early years. Biographers wonder, did the very intensity of this religious education plant the seeds of his rebellion? When you study the Talmud, you are taught to argue. You are taught to look for contradictions, to debate the meaning of a word, to turn a sentence over and over until it reveals its truth. It is a training in critical thinking. Perhaps by teaching him to question the text so deeply, his teachers inadvertently taught him to question the divine origin of the text itself. They handed him a lantern to read the scriptures, not realizing that he would eventually use that lantern to look into the dark corners they wanted to keep hidden. He would use their own logic to dismantle their world. But for now, he is just a boy in a bustling city. He is safe. He is loved. He walks home from school as the evening mist rolls in off the Zuiderzee, blurring the sharp outlines of the gabled houses. He holds his father's hand. The lanterns are being lit along the canal, casting rippling reflections on the black water. It is a world of order, of commerce, and of faith. Yet underneath this golden surface, there were shadows. The community that sheltered him was a community built on fear. They were survivors of a Holocaust of their own time, the Inquisition. And to understand the pressure that would eventually crush Spinoza out of this fold, we have to understand the ghosts that haunted the dinner tables of his neighbors. We have to look south to Spain and Portugal and the fires that were still burning there. The ghosts that sat at the dinner tables of Leuenberg were not metaphorical. They were memories of fire and iron. To understand why the community eventually turned on Spinoza with such ferocity, we have to understand the journey that brought them to the damp soil of the Netherlands. We have to understand that for the Spinoza family and their neighbors, simply being Jewish was an act of defiance that had cost them everything. Let's drift south, crossing the Pyrenees into the sun-drenched lands of Spain and Portugal. For centuries, this had been a golden land for Jewish culture, a place where poets and philosophers thrived under Islamic rule. But in 1492, the world shattered. The Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, issued the Alhambra decree: convert to Christianity, leave the country, or die. Many left, but many stayed, and later in Portugal, many were forcibly baptized, dragged to fonts, and declared Christians against their will. They were called conversos, or new Christians. Behind their backs, the old Christians called them Marano's swine. Imagine living a life where your soul is a secret. For over 100 years, Spinoza's ancestors lived a split existence. On the street, they went to Mass. They ate pork, or pretended to. They baptized their children. But behind closed shutters, in the terrified silence of their basements, they tried to hold on to fragments of their identity. They lit candles on Friday nights, hiding the light inside clay pitchers so the neighbors wouldn't see. They whispered prayers they barely remembered. They lived in the shadow of the Inquisition. This was a terror state, a bureaucracy of paranoia. If you refused to eat pork, you were suspect. If you put on a clean shirt on a Saturday, you were suspect. If your chimney didn't smoke on the Sabbath when everyone else was cooking, the inquisitors would knock on your door. And the punishment was the auto da fe, the act of faith. This was a public burning. Men and women were tied to stakes and consumed by fire while crowds cheered. This wasn't ancient history to the people of Spinoza's Amsterdam. It was current events. It was the nightmare that woke them up screaming. Spinoza's own grandfather, Isaac, had lived through this in Lisbon before fleeing to Nantes and then to Rotterdam. His father, Michael, had likely felt the fear of the Inquisitor's shadow before finding safety in the north. When these refugees finally arrived in Amsterdam, they called it the New Jerusalem. Here, for the first time in generations, they could be Jews openly. They could build a synagogue. They could sing. The relief must have been intoxicating, like breathing fresh air after holding your breath underwater for a century. But there was a complication. After living as secret Catholics for generations, many of these refugees had forgotten what it actually meant to be Jewish. They knew the idea of Judaism or heroic biblical faith of patriarchs and prophets, but they didn't know the reality of rabbinic Judaism, the dietary laws, the intricate rituals, the endless rules of the Talmud. When they arrived in Amsterdam, they didn't find the romantic faith they had imagined in their secret prayers. They found a religion of structure, law, and detail. Some were disappointed. Some were confused. They had to be re-educated. The community leaders, the Mamad, were terrified that if these new arrivals were not strictly disciplined, they might drift back to Christianity or into atheism. They felt they had to build a fortress of orthodoxy to protect this fragile remnant. This is a crucial psychological point. The Portuguese Jewish community of Amsterdam was not secure. It was traumatized. Like many survivors of trauma, they sought safety in absolute order. Unity was their only defense. If one person stepped out of line, if one person mocked the law or caused a scandal, they feared the Dutch authorities might revoke their welcome. They feared the chaos would return. So the community became stricter, perhaps, than older, more established Jewish communities in Venice or Poland. They policed each other. They banned books. They scrutinized behavior. They were guarding the flame they had rescued from the fire, and they were terrified of a sudden gust of wind. It was into this atmosphere of anxious, rigid orthodoxy that Baruch was born. But here is the difference. Baruch had never seen the fires. He had never had to hide his prayers. He was a child of the New Jerusalem, born into freedom. He didn't carry the survivor's guilt or the desperate need for conformity that his father and the elders felt. To him, the rituals might not have felt like a hard-won privilege. They might have felt like just another set of rules. There is a tragic story that hovered over Spinoza's childhood, a cautionary tale that everyone in the neighborhood knew. It was the story of Uriel da Costa. Da Costa was a passionate, romantic figure who had fled Portugal, eager to embrace the Judaism of his ancestors. But when he arrived in Amsterdam, he was shocked by the rabbinic laws, which he felt were man-made and soulless. He wrote books attacking the rabbis. He was excommunicated. Eventually, broken by loneliness and the need to belong, Da Costa recanted. But the humiliation was severe. In a grim public ceremony in the synagogue, he was forced to lie across the threshold while the entire congregation stepped over his body. Shattered by the shame, Da Costa went home, wrote a final testament, and shot himself. Spinoza was a young boy, about 8 years old, when Da Costa died. It is very likely he heard the whispers, perhaps even witnessed the shunning. Some biographers wonder, did the ghost of Uriel da Costa haunt Spinoza? Did he look at that broken man and vow, I will never let them break me like that? Did he realize early on that the price of truth in this community could be your life? Yet, despite the strictness, there was beauty in this world. The Portuguese synagogue, the Asnoga, was a place of grandeur. Imagine the young Baruch standing there on Yom Kippur. The floor is covered in fine sand to muffle the sound of footsteps and to remind them of the desert wanderings, and perhaps, subconsciously, to remind them of the sand they used to put on their floors in Portugal to muffle the sounds of secret prayer. The light filters in through massive windows. Hundreds of candles burn in brass chandeliers. The men are wrapped in white prayer shawls, rocking, their voices rising in a haunting, melodic chant that sounds more like a Spanish fado than a European hymn. It is a moment of profound belonging. Spinoza stands there, surrounded by his father, his uncles, the men who survived. He is part of the tribe. He is the hope of the lineage. At this moment, looking at the boy with the dark, intelligent eyes, no one could imagine that he would become the greatest heretic in their history. They looked at him and saw a guardian of the law. But Baruch was already noticing things. He was noticing that the rabbis insisted on things that didn't make sense. He was noticing that the truth seemed to change depending on who was arguing. He was a lens grinder in the making, and he was beginning to spot the cracks in the glass. And then, just as his mind was beginning to open, his heart was broken. The safety of his childhood was shattered not by a theological argument, but by a very human loss. A loss that would leave him staring into the void, asking questions that the Torah couldn't answer. The year was 1638. The smell of death was drifting through the streets of Amsterdam, mingling with the spices and the sea salt. The records are quiet on the exact cause, but in the damp, crowded city, illness was a constant specter: tuberculosis, plague, fevers that burned through households in days. For 6-year-old Bento, the world suddenly shrank to the bedside of his mother, Hannah Deborah. She was Michael de Spinoza's second wife, a woman of some standing and grace. But to Bento, she was simply the center of the universe. She was the softness in a world of rigid laws. We don't know the details of her passing, only the stark fact recorded in the burial registry of the Outer Kirk Cemetery. She died on November 5, 1638. She was relatively young. Imagine the confusion of a 6-year-old boy. The house, usually filled with the sounds of managing a merchant's household, fell silent. Mirrors were covered in accordance with Jewish mourning custom. His father, Michael, sat on a low stool, his garment torn, reciting the Kaddish. The community came to offer comfort, bringing hard-boiled eggs and lentils, foods that symbolized the cycle of life, round and endless. But for a child, symbols offer little comfort against the cold reality of absence. This was Spinoza's first deep encounter with the fragility of life. One moment, a person is warm, speaking, loving. The next, they are a body. And then, nothing. Where did she go? The rabbis spoke of the world to come, of the resurrection of the dead, of the immortality of the soul. But did Bento believe them? Even then? Biographers speculate that the death of his mother created a fissure in his heart that eventually became a fissure in his faith. When you watch a parent die, you are forced to confront the mechanical nature of the body. You see the breath stop. You see the light leave the eyes. It looks terrifyingly final. It looks like a machine breaking down, not a spirit flying away. Perhaps this was the seed of his later radical idea, Deus sive natura, God or nature. Maybe he began to feel that God was a kindly grandfather in the sky who took his mother away for a mysterious purpose. Maybe God was just the force of nature itself, the bacteria that caused the sickness, the wind that blew the ships, the inevitable cycle of life and death. Not cruel, not kind, just inevitable. Despite the grief, life had to go on. In the 17th century, childhood was not a long, protected garden. It was a short hallway to adulthood. Bento returned to the Talmud Torah school. He was now a star pupil. His teachers were men of immense learning, most notably Rabbi Saul Levi Mortera. Mortera was a fiery, majestic figure, a man who had founded the Keter Torah Academy. He saw the brilliance in Spinoza. He saw a mind that could categorize, analyze, and synthesize information with frightening speed. In the classroom, the boys studied the Hebrew Bible, but they also studied the commentators: Rashi, Ibn Ezra, Maimonides. Maimonides was the key. The great medieval philosopher had tried to reconcile Aristotle with the Torah. He had tried to show that faith and reason were compatible. Young Spinoza devoured Maimonides. But as he read, he found something dangerous in Maimonides' own method. Maimonides often hinted that the Bible shouldn't always be taken literally, that when the Bible speaks of God's hand or God's anger, it is speaking in metaphors for the common people, because the human mind cannot grasp the true, abstract nature of God. Spinoza took this ball and ran with it. If God doesn't have a hand, he might have thought, does he have a voice? Did he really speak words at Mount Sinai? Or is the Torah a human book, written by men trying to interpret the divine laws of nature? There is a charming, though perhaps apocryphal, story about Spinoza's precociousness. It is said that in school, when studying the story of Eve being created from Adam's rib, he asked a question about the logic of the anatomy that stumped his teachers. He wasn't trying to be difficult. He just couldn't turn off the logic switch. If A implies B and B implies C, he couldn't pretend that A implied D just because the Holy Book said so. As he entered his teenage years, the boy named Bento began to fade and a young scholar emerged. He was sharp, perhaps a bit arrogant in the way teenagers can be when they realize they might be smarter than their teachers. He was wrestling with the heavyweights of Jewish thought. But outside the synagogue walls, another world was calling. The Spinoza family business was trade importing dried fruit, wine, and olive oil from Portugal and the Mediterranean. As Bento grew older, his father needed help. The business was struggling. The Dutch waged a long war with Spain and Portugal for global dominance, and trade routes were often disrupted by privateers and blockades. Michael de Spinoza needed a son who could count crates of figs, not just count angels on the head of a pin. So Bento began to split his time. Half the day in the world of eternal divine law, the other half in the gritty, chaotic world of the Amsterdam docks. He learned bookkeeping. He learned to negotiate in Portuguese and Dutch. He learned the value of currency. This practical education was just as important as his theological one. It grounded him. It taught him that the world runs on contracts, on trust, and on tangible goods. It saved him from becoming a mystic who floats away in visions. Spinoza would always remain a realist. Even his most abstract philosophy is built like a contract proposition, demonstration, scholium. It is the philosophy of a merchant's son who wants to see the goods before he pays. But there was friction. The business was risky. Debts piled up. His father, Michael, was a stubborn man, trying to hold the family fortune together. He likely looked at his brilliant son and hoped he would save the business. He didn't know that Bento was already mentally packing his bags, preparing to leave not just the warehouse, but the entire worldview of his ancestors. It was around this time, in his late teens, that Spinoza began to drift away from the strict path of the rabbinate. He stopped being the golden boy. He began to ask the questions out loud. Is the soul really immortal? Do angels exist? Is God really a person who cares if I eat a ham sandwich? These weren't just questions. In 1640s Amsterdam, they were sparks falling on dry tinder. And there were people watching zealous men, fearful men waiting to stomp them out. But before the fire, there was one more tragedy to come, one that would cut the last anchor holding him to the harbor of his youth. The death of his father. The shadows in the synagogue were lengthening, both literally and metaphorically. We are now in the early 1650s. Bento is in his early 20s. He is no longer the bright-eyed child holding his father's hand. He is a young man with a stillness about him that unnerves people. In the Portuguese synagogue, there was an expectation of fervor. Men prayed with passion. They debated with fire. But Spinoza? He was cool. He listened more than he spoke. And when he did speak, his questions had a way of slicing through the comfortable padding of tradition and hitting the hard bone of logic underneath. The shadows in the synagogue were not just the dim corners where men gathered to gossip. They were the doubts growing in Spinoza's own mind. The grief over his mother was an old scar now, but it had left him with a sensitivity to the question of the afterlife. The rabbis taught that the soul was immortal, that there was a world of reward and punishment waiting beyond the grave. But Spinoza, reading the Hebrew Bible in its original language, noticed something troubling. The Torah, the 5 books of Moses, hardly mentions the afterlife at all. It speaks of land, of cattle, of longevity, of children. It speaks of this world. The detailed geography of heaven and hell was a later invention, imported by the Pharisees and expanded by the rabbis. He began to whisper these dangerous thoughts to other students. Imagine two young men walking along the Amstel River, their breath fogging in the cold air. If the Torah is the perfect word of God, Spinoza might have asked, why does it never say, your soul will live forever? Why does it only say, your days shall be long upon the land? These weren't just academic questions. They were tremors shaking the foundation of the community's authority. If there is no afterlife, then the rabbis lose their greatest leverage, fear of what happens when you die. It is here that we encounter the spies. The community was small, and jealousy is a weed that grows in tight spaces. There were other students who envied Spinoza's intellect, or perhaps they were genuinely terrified by his skepticism. Two of them tradition names them as a certain Nabra, and a man named De Silva approached Spinoza, pretending to seek his wisdom. They flattered him. Bento, they said, you are the smartest of us. Tell us, does God have a body? Does God have dimensions? Spinoza, perhaps young and naive, or perhaps just tired of pretending, dropped his guard. He told them that in the Bible, God is often described with physical attributes, hands, feet, eyes. He suggested that perhaps God and the physical universe were not two separate things. He hinted that the soul was simply life, not a ghost in a machine. The students nodded, their faces grim. They had what they needed. They reported him to the Mamad, the Council of Elders. The shadows were closing in. But before the storm of excommunication could break, the final pillar of Spinoza's old life collapsed. In March 1654, Michael de Spinoza died. The man who had carried the family from the fires of the Inquisition to the safety of the canals, who had built a business, who had buried 3 wives and 4 children, finally succumbed to the exhaustion of survival. For Spinoza, this was a cataclysmic shift. As long as his father was alive, Bento had maintained a veneer of conformity. He kept the Sabbath. He attended services largely out of respect or honor thy father. He knew that his heresy would break the old man's heart. But now, standing over his father's grave in the Outer Kirk Cemetery, reciting the Kaddish, Spinoza was truly alone. He was 21 years old. He was an orphan. The Outer Kirk Cemetery is a beautiful, melancholic place. It sits beside the Amstel River. You can visit it today. The stones are sinking into the soft Dutch soil, tilted at odd angles, covered in moss. The inscriptions are in Portuguese and Hebrew, recounting the glory of the new Christians who returned to the fold. As Spinoza walked away from that grave, the tether snapped. He was now the head of the household. He was responsible for his father's debts, his father's business, and his own destiny. He was free from the obligation to please a parent, but he was also stripped of the protection a parent provides. The shadows in the synagogue shifted from theological doubts to legal battles. In the wake of Michael's death, a bitter dispute arose over the inheritance. Spinoza's half-sister Rebecca tried to claim the estate, arguing that as the son of a different mother, or perhaps just to seize the assets, Bento should be excluded. This moment reveals the steel in Spinoza's character. He wasn't a passive dreamer. He took his sister to the Dutch civil court, not the Jewish rabbinical court, which was a slap in the face to the community. He used the law of the land to fight for his rights. He argued, he presented evidence, and he won. The judge ruled in his favor. And then, In a move that baffled everyone, Spinoza did something extraordinary. Once he had the court order in his hand, once he had proven that he could win, that justice was on his side, he gave it all to her. He kept only a quiet bed, a good bed, the records note, with curtains, and perhaps a few books. He handed the rest of the inheritance to Rebecca. Why? Because for Spinoza, the fight wasn't about the money. It was about the principle. It was about justice. Once reason had prevailed, once the truth was established, he had no need for the material possessions. He didn't want the crates of figs or the casks of wine. He didn't want the merchant's life. He walked out of that courtroom and back into the shadows, leaving the money on the table. It was his first major step toward the ascetic life he would choose. But he couldn't walk away completely just yet. He had a business to run, debts to pay, and a community that was watching his every move, waiting for him to slip. The synagogue, once a sanctuary, had become a cage, and Bento was testing the bars. The ledgers of the firm, Bento y Gabriel de Spinoza, tell a story of their own, written in ink that fades from black to red. We are in the mid-1650s now. The young philosopher has stepped into his father's shoes, but they do not fit him. He is trying to be a merchant in a city where commerce is a blood sport, and his heart is simply not in the kill. Imagine the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, the Beurs, in 1655. It is an architectural marvel, a rectangular courtyard surrounded by a colonnade, open to the sky. It is the engine room of the Golden Age. Hundreds of men in black robes and tall hats swarm the floor. The noise is deafening, a cacophony of Dutch, French, Portuguese, and English, all shouting prices, negotiating insurance rates for ships bound for the Indies, betting on the future price of tulips or grain. In the middle of this chaos stands Bento. He is holding bills of exchange, pieces of paper that promise payment upon the safe. Arrival of a cargo of dried figs or almonds. But the sea is treacherous. The First Anglo-Dutch War has just ended, but the waters are still swarming with English privateers and Barbary corsairs. A ship carrying your entire fortune can be captured off the coast of Portugal or smashed against the rocks of the English Channel. For a man like Spinoza, who craved certainty, who looked for the eternal geometric laws that bind the universe, this life of gambling must have been torture. Merchant life is built on contingency. Things might happen, or they might not. You might be rich on Tuesday and a pauper on Wednesday. It is a life of anxiety. He would return to the warehouse on the Houtgracht, the smell of rotting fruit sometimes mingling with the sweet scent of the good stock. He had to deal with creditors, with angry customers, with the endless petty disputes of trade. There are records of bills unpaid, of financial stress tightening around his neck like a noose. The firm was drowning in debt, partly due to the war, partly due to bad luck, but perhaps partly due to a manager whose mind was contemplating the infinite rather than the inventory. It is in this crucible of stress that the seeds of his greatest ethical insights were likely planted. In his later writing, specifically the treatise on the emendation of the intellect, Spinoza describes this period with heartbreaking clarity. He writes about realizing that the things men usually chase, wealth, honor, and sensual pleasure, are vain and futile. He noticed a pattern. When you chase money, you are never satisfied. If you get it, you fear losing it. If you don't get it, you are miserable. Your happiness is held hostage by things outside your control. He called these perishable goods. He realized that building your happiness on the arrival of a ship is a recipe for madness, because the ocean doesn't care about you. He began to ask, is there a True good? Is there something I can love that will never perish, never change, and never be taken away from me? This wasn't just philosophy. It was a survival strategy. He was looking for an emotional anchor in a life that was falling apart. While his brother Gabriel tried to keep the business afloat, Bento's mind was drifting to the one place where he felt the stability he craved, the Latin school of Franciscus van den Enden. We will explore this school more deeply in a moment, but for now, know that it was his escape hatch. It was where he went to breathe. But the walls of reality were closing in on the young merchant. The debts left by his father were substantial. Creditors were knocking on the door of the warehouse. In a move that showed his practical, unsentimental side, Spinoza made a difficult legal maneuver. He declared himself a minor. Under Dutch law, since he was barely past the age of majority and had been orphaned, he could argue that he wasn't fully responsible for his father's debts. It was a humiliating necessity. It meant effectively declaring the business bankrupt. It meant walking away from the commercial legacy of his ancestors. The community watched this failure with judgment. In their eyes, he was failing his duty. He wasn't maintaining the family honor. But Spinoza was doing something else. He was shedding his skin. He was cutting the ropes that tied him to the material world. He watched the business collapse, and strangely, he felt lighter. There is a moment we can imagine, perhaps late one night in the warehouse. A candle is burning low. The ledger lies open, full of negative numbers. Bento looks at the rows of figures, debts, promises, losses, and he closes the book. He pushes it away. He realizes that the mathematics of commerce is a trap, but the mathematics of the universe is a liberation. He decides, then and there, that he will not spend his life chasing finite modes, temporary things. He will chase the infinite. This failure as a merchant is the pivotal trial and error moment of his life. If he had been a successful businessman, if the ships had arrived safely, if the profits had rolled in, we might never have had Spinoza the philosopher. He might have become a wealthy, respected pillar of the synagogue, fat and happy, spending his evenings counting coins instead of writing the ethics. Success is often a comfortable cage. Failure broke the lock. By 1656, the business was effectively dead. Bento was poor. He had no career, no parents, and his standing in the community was eroding by the day. But he had found a new kind of wealth. He had found a group of friends, free thinkers, dissidents, Christians who didn't fit into their own churches, who valued him not for his credit rating, but for his mind. He began to live a double life. By day, he dealt with the crumbling ruins of the import business. By night, he was stepping into a dangerous, thrilling world of radical ideas. He was crossing the canal, physically and intellectually, leaving the Jewish quarter to study with a man who was rumored to be an atheist, a revolutionary, and a genius. The reluctance was gone. The merchant was dead. The philosopher was waking up. And the tool that would sharpen his mind wasn't the Talmud anymore. It was a language he wasn't supposed to know, teaching him ideas he wasn't supposed to hear. To find the spark that would finally ignite the powder keg of Spinoza's life, we have to follow him across the city. We have to watch him leave the Jewish quarter, cross the wooden bridges over the murky canals, and arrive at a house on the Singel, one of the most prestigious canals in Amsterdam. Here, behind the respectable facade of a bookshop and art gallery, lay a world that was even more dangerous than the one he was leaving. This was the Latin school of Franciscus van den Enden. If the synagogue was a fortress of tradition, Van den Enden School was a laboratory of revolution. Franciscus van den Enden was a character straight out of a novel. He was an ex-Jesuit who had been kicked out of the order, a medical doctor, a supposed atheist, and a fierce advocate for democracy long before it was fashionable. He was a man who believed that people should rule, not kings. Years later, at the age of 72, he would actually be hanged in Paris for plotting to overthrow Louis XIV and establish a republic in Normandy. That was the kind of fire Spinoza was walking into. Bento came here for a practical reason: to learn Latin. Latin was the coding language of the 17th century intellectual world. If you wanted to read science, law, or philosophy, if you wanted to read the works of the Gentiles, you had to know Latin. For a young Jewish man to seek this education was already a sign that he was looking over the wall. But Van den Enden didn't just teach grammar. He taught life. Imagine the atmosphere in that school. It wasn't a dry classroom. It was alive with debate. Van den Enden staged plays and Latin comedies by Terence and tragedies by Seneca, and made his students act in them to improve their speech. There is a persistent tradition, debated by scholars but lovely to imagine, that the quiet, reserved Spinoza might have taken the stage, reciting lines about human folly and fate, learning to project a voice that had been trained to whisper. And then there is the story of Clara Maria. Van den Enden had a daughter, Clara Maria. She was young, brilliant, and reportedly helped her father teach the students. She was a flute player and a Latin scholar in her own right. The legend passed down by early biographers like Coleris says that Spinoza fell in love with her. They say he was charmed by her wit and her music. The story goes that he intended to marry her, but a wealthier student named Dirk Kerkering arrived, wooed her with a pearl necklace, and stole her heart. Did this actually happen? Most modern historians are skeptical. Spinoza was broke, focused, and socially separated from her by a chasm of religion and class. But the fact that the story exists tells us something about how people saw him. They wanted to see a human heart beating beneath the robes of the philosopher. They wanted to believe that before he fell in love with the universe, he almost fell in love with the girl playing the flute. Even if the romance was a myth, the intellectual seduction was real. Through Van den Enden, Spinoza met the mind that would change him forever, René Descartes. Descartes had died just a few years earlier, in 1650, but his ghost haunted every university in Europe. He was the rock star of the new philosophy. Spinoza likely picked up Descartes' Meditations or Principles of Philosophy in Van den Enden's library, and it must have felt like putting on a pair of glasses for the first time. Descartes swept away the dusty, circular arguments of medieval scholastics. He started with doubt. De omnibus dubitandum est, everything must be doubted. He doubted his senses. He doubted traditions. He doubted the existence of the world. He stripped everything away until he hit the one bedrock truth he couldn't doubt. Cogito, ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. For Spinoza, this method was electrifying. It was pure. It didn't rely on Rabbi so-and-so said. It relied on the naked human intellect. But as Spinoza read Descartes, a shift occurred. He was like a student who learns the master's technique so well he surpasses the master. Descartes had stopped halfway. Descartes said the universe was mechanical, ruled by physics, except for the human soul and God, which sat outside the machine. Spinoza looked at that and shook his head. No, he thought, you can't have it both ways. If the universe is a machine of cause and effect, then everything must be in the machine. God isn't outside pushing the buttons. God is the machine. God is the energy, the laws, the substance of reality itself. This was the dangerous idea taking root in the Latin school. Spinoza was beginning to see the universe as a single seamless unity. No miracles, no supernatural intervention. Just one infinite glowing substance unfolding according to perfect necessity. It was beautiful. It was clean. And to the rabbis back in Vluyenburg, it was absolute blasphemy. The Jewish community was not blind. They saw Spinoza crossing the canal. They knew he was spending his days with atheists and libertines. In the 17th century, the line between Gentile philosopher and heretic was razor thin. They saw their brightest student drifting into a world of theater, politics, and radical science. Tensions began to rise on the streets. Spinoza was no longer hiding his disdain for superstition. There is a dramatic account of an assassination attempt from this period. It reads like a scene from a thriller. One night, as Spinoza was leaving the theater or perhaps the synagogue, a man stepped out of the shadows. A dagger flashed in the moonlight. The attacker lunged, shouting heretic or traitor. Spinoza reacted just in time, twisting away. The blade missed his heart but sliced through his cloak. Spinoza kept that cloak for years. He would show it to his friends, pointing to the slit in the heavy fabric. This, he would say, is the beginning of wisdom. It was a memento mori, a reminder of the fanaticism that fear can breed. Whether the dagger was real or a metaphor for the sharp hostility he faced, the message was clear. You are not safe here anymore. The elders of the synagogue, the Mamad, were in a panic. They were trying to protect their fragile community from the wrath of the Dutch Calvinist authorities, who tolerated Jews but forbade atheism. If one of their own was running around Amsterdam preaching that God was just nature and that the Bible was a man-made book, the Dutch might shut down the whole synagogue. Spinoza wasn't just a heretic, he was a liability. They tried to reason with him. They called him in. They offered him a pension, a bribe, essentially of 1,000 florins a year if he would just stay quiet and show up to the synagogue occasionally. Just pretend, Bento. Just keep the peace. But Spinoza looked at them with that calm, infuriating rationality. He couldn't be bought. Truth wasn't a commodity to be traded for a pension. He refused. He stopped paying his synagogue dues. He stopped attending services. He was effectively resigning from the tribe. But in the 17th century, you couldn't just resign. Religion wasn't a club. It was your citizenship, your legal status, your family, your identity. To leave was to become a non-person. The Mamad realized they had no choice. They had to cut out the infection before it spread. They prepared the ultimate weapon in their arsenal, the cherem. It was the summer of 1656. The heat lay heavy on the canals. The air was thick with the smell of stagnant water and impending doom. Spinoza was 23 years old. He was about to face a judgment that would echo through history, a curse so violent, so comprehensive, that it still chills the blood when read today. The Latin school had given him the tools to think for himself. Now he would have to pay the price for that independence. July 27, 1656. It was a Thursday. The summer heat was likely oppressive, pressing down on the gabled roofs of Vluyenburg. Inside the synagogue building on the Houtgracht, the precursor to the great Esnoga it stands today, the air was heavy with a terrifying solemnity. The Ark of the Covenant, usually the symbol of God's protective presence, was open. The scrolls of the Torah were visible. But the mood was not one of worship. It was one of execution. Baruch Spinoza was not there. He had wisely chosen not to attend his own spiritual funeral, but the community was there. His former teachers, the men who had praised his brilliance as a child, the neighbors who had eaten at his table, they were all gathered to witness the severance of a limb from the body of the nation. The ceremony of the cherem is a piece of theater designed to induce pure psychological terror. Tradition dictates that black wax candles are lit. As the curse is read, they are extinguished one by one, symbolizing the spiritual light of the sinner being snuffed out, leaving only darkness and smoke. Listen to the words that rang out in that hall. They were read from a document that still exists in the archives of the Amsterdam community. It is distinct because usually bans were temporary, a slap on the wrist to bring a wayward member back in line. But this one? This was final. This was a nuclear option. The cantor's voice would have risen and fallen with the cadence of doom. The lords of the Mamad, having long known of the evil opinions and acts of Baruch de Spinoza, have decided, with the consent of the rabbis, that the said Spinoza should be excommunicated and expelled from the people of Israel. And then the curses began. They didn't just kick him out. They dismantled his existence with words. Cursed be he by day, and cursed be he by night. Cursed be he when he lies down, and cursed be he when he rises up. Cursed be he when he goes out, and cursed be he when he comes in. The Lord will not spare him, but the anger of the Lord and his jealousy shall smoke against this man, and the Lord shall blot out his name from under heaven. Imagine the wax dripping, the smoke rising, the silence in the room as the final candle was plunged into a vat of blood or water, extinguishing the flame. Then came the social death sentence. The decree warned every member of the community. No one should communicate with him, not even in writing, nor accord him any favor, nor stay with him under the same roof, nor come within 4 cubits in his vicinity, nor shall he read any treatise composed or written by him. 4 cubits. About 6 feet. It was a physical quarantine. If his sister saw him on the street, she had to cross to the other side. If his old friends saw him, they had to look away. He was a ghost walking among the living. He was cherem, a Hebrew word that means both devoted to destruction and banned. Why was it so harsh? This is a question that historians still debate. Was Spinoza really that evil? Or was this a performance? Some scholars suspect the Jewish leaders were terrified that the Dutch magistrates would see Spinoza, atheism, as a Jewish problem. By cursing him so violently, they were shouting to the Christian authorities, "Look, we hate him too. We are good, religious people. Don't blame us for him." It was a sacrificial offering to the god of political safety. And where was Spinoza while this was happening? He was likely sitting in a room not far away, perhaps at the house of Van den Enden, or staying with a sympathetic Christian friend. He didn't storm the synagogue. He didn't scream back. When the news was brought to him, perhaps by a messenger who stood safely 4 cubits away, his reaction was chillingly calm. Tradition attributes a simple, stoic sentence to him: "This compels me to do nothing that I should not have done otherwise." He didn't weep. He didn't fight. He reportedly wrote a short defense in Spanish, justifying his views, but that document is lost to history. Instead of devastation, he seemed to feel a sense of relief. The hypocrisy was over. He no longer had to bow at the right times or mutter prayers he didn't believe in, or pretend that the God of the Torah was the God of the universe. He later said that the ban forced him onto the path he was meant to walk anyway. It stripped him of his inheritance, his family, and his past. He was now 23 years old, entirely unmoored from the world he was born into. But there is a human cost to this kind of freedom. We often romanticize the lone genius But imagine the silence of that first night. No family dinners. No community support network. In the 17th century, the individual was nothing. The group was everything. To be cut off was to be defenseless. Yet Spinoza didn't crumble. He did something symbolic that showed his intent to move forward. He stopped answering to Baruch, which means blessed in Hebrew. He translated his name into Latin. From that day on, he signed his letters Benedictus. It means the same thing, blessed, but in the universal language of the scholar, the scientist, the citizen of the world. He packed his few belongings, his books, his clothes, perhaps the cloak with the dagger hole in it. He left the Jewish quarter. He didn't leave Amsterdam immediately, but he had legally and spiritually emigrated. He moved into the attic of the world. The New Jerusalem had cast him out, so he decided to build a new city, not of brick and stone, but of ideas. A city where the walls were made of logic, and the light was the light of reason. The young man who walked away from Vluyenburg was no longer the son of Michael de Spinoza. He was Benedictus de Spinoza, a lens grinder. And as he stepped onto the road that would lead him to the quiet villages of Regensburg and Vorburg, he carried with him the heavy, beautiful burden of absolute intellectual freedom. The transition from Baruch to Benedictus was not sudden. It was a slow, deliberate shedding of layers, like a snake leaving behind a skin that has become too tight. After the ban in 1656, Spinoza didn't vanish immediately into the countryside. He lingered on the outskirts of Amsterdam, for a time staying in a house on the Ouwerkerk Road, breathing the air of a man who has just walked out of a collapsing building and is checking his limbs to make sure he is still whole. He realized he was whole. In fact, he was more whole than he had ever been. He began to sign his correspondence Benedictus. It is a beautiful choice. In Hebrew, Baruch means blessed. In Latin, Benedictus means blessed. By keeping the meaning but changing the language, he was making a subtle but profound statement. I am still blessed. I am still holy, but my holiness no longer belongs to a tribe. It belongs to the world. But Amsterdam, with its noise and its memories, was too loud for the work he needed to do. The city was a place of commerce, of friction, of constant social negotiation. Spinoza needed silence. He needed a laboratory for the soul. So around 1660 or 1661, he packed his few belongings and moved to the village of Regensburg. Imagine the change in scenery. You leave behind the dense, brick-lined canals, the smell of tar and spices, and the constant shouting of the stock exchange. You walk out into the flat, infinite horizon of the Dutch countryside. The sky here is massive, a vast dome of gray and blue clouds that seem to weigh heavy on the land. The only vertical lines are the church steeples and the windmills, their sails turning slowly in the relentless wind. Regensburg was a quiet place, known for its vegetable gardens and its slow pace of life. But for Spinoza, it was a sanctuary. He rented a small cottage on the Katwijker Lane. You can still visit this house today. It is humble, made of brick and wood, with low ceilings and small windows. It feels like a monastery cell for a monk of no religion. He wasn't entirely alone, though. He found kindred spirits in a group called the Collegians. These were Christians, but not the kind who ran the state church. They were dissenters, pacifists, people who believed in a church without walls. They rejected clergy, they rejected dogma, and they believed that the Spirit of God could speak to anyone, even a humble lens grinder. They welcomed Spinoza. They didn't care that he was an ex-Jew or a suspected atheist. They cared that he was a man of integrity. They called him the blessed philosopher. It is a touching image. The Jewish heretic sitting in a farmhouse with Christian dissenters, drinking warm beer or tea, discussing the nature of God while the rain lashed against the windows. They found a common language in their shared rejection of authority, but mostly, Spinoza chose solitude. This wasn't the loneliness of the outcast. It was the deliberate solitude of the thinker. He needed long stretches of uninterrupted time to follow a chain of logic from the beginning of the universe to the nature of human happiness. He began to craft a daily routine that would define the rest of his life. It was a rhythm of almost military discipline, but gentle. He would rise early, light his pipe, and work at his grinding bench for a few hours. Then, he would sit at his desk and write. He ate simply mostly milk porridge with butter, perhaps a little beer or raisins. He lived on just a few stewivers a day. There is a pervasive myth that Spinoza lived in poverty because he was forced to. That is not true. He lived in poverty because he chose to. He had friends wealthy, powerful friends in Amsterdam, who were appalled by his living conditions. They tried to give him money. A young admirer named Simon de Vries, a wealthy merchant who adored Spinoza, once tried to gift him a holding of 2,000 florins. It was a fortune. It would have allowed Spinoza to stop grinding lenses and live in comfort for the rest of his life. Spinoza refused. He told de Vries that the money would be a distraction. He argued that wealth brings complexity. You have to manage it. You have to worry about it. You have to defend it. Nature is satisfied with little, he said. And if she is, I am too. Later, when de Vries was dying young, he wanted to make Spinoza his sole heir. Again, Spinoza refused. He insisted the money should go to de Vries's brother, keeping only a tiny annuity for himself, just enough to buy bread, tobacco, and glass. This wasn't masochism. It was a strategy for freedom. Spinoza understood something that many of us forget. If you take the king's coin, you have to sing the king's song. By staying poor, by earning his own keep with the labor of his hands, he remained beholden to no one. He could write exactly what he thought, without worrying about offending a patron or losing a pension. His poverty was his shield. In this small cottage in Regensburg, the Benedictus persona fully emerged. He became a man of extreme self-control. He was never seen to be very angry, nor very sad. He wasn't a robot, but he had achieved a state of equanimity. When the village children threw stones at him or called him names, he didn't shout back. When his landlady asked him if her religion would save her soul, he didn't mock her simple faith. He told her, "Your religion is good. You need not seek another, nor doubt that you will be saved, provided that while applying yourself to piety, you live a peaceable and quiet life." He had moved beyond the need to be right in an argument. He was interested in the truth, not in winning. It was here, in the quiet of Regensburg, that he began to sketch out the great work of his life. He began to treat philosophy not as a series of essays, but as a geometry problem. He wanted to prove the nature of emotions with the same certainty that Euclid proved the nature of triangles. He would sit at his desk, dipping his quill into the ink, and write the word definitions. By that which is self-caused, I mean that of which the essence involves existence. He was building a universe on paper, and to keep his mind sharp, to keep his hands busy, he turned back to the wheel. The grinding, the polishing, the physical act that mirrored his mental act. The villagers of Regensburg got used to him. He became the philosopher on the corner, a harmless, quiet man who received strange letters from all over Europe and who ground glass so clear it seemed to disappear. They didn't know that in that small room, he was dismantling the concept of a judgmental God and replacing it with a God of infinite, indifferent perfection. He had found his fortress, but the world outside was still turbulent, and his ideas were too big to stay contained in a cottage for long. The lenses he was making were about to help others see the stars, but the book he was writing was about to make the whole world blink. Word count 1,150. Let's step closer to the bench. We have talked about the grinding wheel as a background noise, but tonight, I want you to really feel the texture of Spinoza's daily labor. It wasn't just a way to pay for bread. It was the physical counterpart to his mental architecture. In the 17th century, making a lens was an act of supreme patience. You couldn't just order a clear piece of glass from a factory. You started with a rough chunk, often flawed with bubbles or veins. Spinoza would mount this glass onto a handle with pitcha, sticky, black, tar-like substance. Then came the iron pans. He had a set of metal basins, each with a different curvature sunk shallow for long-distance telescope lenses, some deep and small for the tiny, high-power lenses of a microscope. He would sprinkle Tripoli powder or fine wet sand into the pan. Then the dance began. He would press the glass against the metal, rotating the wheel with his foot, and move his hand in a complex rhythmic pattern, round and round, but also side to side. If he pressed too hard, the glass would heat up and crack. If he stayed in one spot too long, he would create a flat patch, ruining the curve. It required a feeling in the fingertips, a sensitivity to the microscopic abrasion of the sand. Spinoza became famous for this touch. The great scientist Christian Huygens, who lived nearby in Voorburg and was a bit of a rival, grudgingly admitted that Spinoza's lenses were among the best in Europe. Philosophers and kings wanted them. Why? Because they were true. They didn't distort the image. They allowed light to pass through exactly as the laws of physics dictated. And here lies the deep, poetic connection between his hands and his mind. Spinoza wrote a short treatise on optics called the Tractatus de Aeride, on the rainbow. He understood the mathematics of refraction, how light bends when it hits a denser material. To him, a beam of light wasn't a mystical emanation. It was a physical phenomenon governed by unchangeable laws. Light must bend at a certain angle. It has no choice. This is exactly how he saw God. In traditional religion, God is a king who makes choices. God decides to save this person, or punish that one, or create a miracle to break the rules of nature. But as Spinoza polished his glass, watching the light obey the math every single time, he realized that God is the math. God doesn't decide to make the light bend. God is the very nature of the universe that makes the light bend. God is the structure. God is the law. Think of the satisfaction of that work. The world outside is messy. People are irrational. Politics is a swamp of lies. But here, on the grinding bench, there is absolute honesty. If the curve is true, the image is clear. You cannot lie to a piece of glass. Spinoza was particularly fascinated by the microscope. While Galileo and others were looking up at the stars, a new generation was looking down. They were discovering a terrifying new world, in a drop of water monsters swimming in a tear, forests in a patch of mold. Spinoza owned a microscope. He reportedly spent hours observing the legs of a fly or the structure of a gnat's wing. What did he see? He didn't see gross bugs. He saw the infinite power of God, nature extending down into the smallest atom. He realized that perfection isn't just for the huge things like planets. It is fractal. The same laws that keep the moon in orbit keep the spider alive. The universe is full of conatus, the striving to exist, whether you are a galaxy or a louse. This work was solitary, but it connected him to the Republic of Letters, the network of intellectuals across Europe. When he sent a lens to a scientist, he was sending a tool of truth. He was helping humanity wipe the fog from its eyes. There is a letter where he discusses the best way to polish glass to avoid rings or distortions. His tone is technical, precise, grounded. It reminds us that this man who wrote about intellectual love of God was also a man with dirty fingernails and calloused hands. He wasn't floating in the clouds. He was an engineer of the soul. But there was a meditative quality to the rhythm too. Scritch, 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 hour after hour. Biographers speculate that the grinding allowed his mind to drift into the high abstractions of the ethics. It is hard to write complex philosophy when you are constantly interrupted. But when your hands are occupied with a repetitive, skilled task, your top brain is free to roam. Perhaps the concept of parallelism, the idea that the mind and the body are just two sides of the same coin, came to him here. As his body worked on the physical glass, his mind worked on the idea of the glass. They were moving in perfect sync. The body grinding, the mind thinking. One process, two attributes. He often worked at night. Imagine the scene. The rest of the village is asleep. The wind is howling off the North Sea. Inside the cottage, a single candle burns. Spinoza holds a finished lens up to the flame. He checks for flaws. The light passes through, bending perfectly, focusing to a sharp burning point on the wall. He smiles. It is perfect. He wraps the lens carefully in soft paper. Then he wipes his hands, sits at his desk, and picks up his pen. He has polished the glass. Now he must polish the definitions of joy, sorrow, and desire. He must grind away the superstitions that cloud the human mind until it is as clear and transparent as the lens sitting on his table. He dips the pen. He writes, "The more we understand individual things, the more we understand God. The glass is a way to see God. The logic is a way to be God." But this work had a cost. The air in the room was glittering with death. Every breath he took pulled tiny, razor-sharp shards of silica into his lungs. He was literally inhaling his work. He was consuming the medium of his art. He didn't know it, or perhaps he didn't care, but the very quest for clarity was slowly cutting off his breath. For now, though, he is strong. He is in his 30s. He is entering his prime. And he is about to begin the book that will be his masterpiece. A book written in the shadow of political danger. A book that he will have to hide in a drawer when the visitors come. In 1663, Spinoza moved again. He packed his grinding wheels and his growing stack of manuscripts and traveled a few miles south to Voorburg, a leafy village just outside The Hague. It was a step closer to the center of power, but he was still keeping to the shadows. He rented a room in the house of a painter named Daniel Tiedemann. It was here, in the quiet years of the mid-1660s, that the great book began to take its final form. If you were to open the drawer of Spinoza's desk during this time and lift out the sheaf of papers labeled Ethica, you might be confused. You wouldn't find flowing prose or poetic meditations. You would find something that looked like a high school geometry textbook. The pages were dense with headings. Axiom I, Definition 3. Proposition She, Demonstration QED. This was his geometric method. It was a radical stylistic choice. Spinoza decided to write about God, the human mind, and the wildest storms of human emotion as if he were writing about triangles, lines, and solids. Why? Because Spinoza didn't trust rhetoric. He knew that beautiful words could lie. He knew that preachers could whip crowds into a frenzy with metaphors, and politicians could mask tyranny with patriotic speeches. Language was slippery, but geometry? Geometry was solid. A triangle is a triangle in Amsterdam, in Rome, and on the moon. The angles always add up to 180 degrees. You cannot argue with a proof. You cannot persuade a circle to be a square. So he built his philosophy like a fortress. He started with the simplest definitions and stacked them, brick by brick, until he reached the nature of human happiness. He wanted to prove that envy and hatred are not just sins. They are logical errors. They are calculations that went wrong. He would sit in his room in Voorburg, dipping his quill, and write, "I shall consider human actions and desires in exactly the same manner, as though I were concerned with lines, planes, and solids." It is a deeply soothing way to look at the world, especially when you are trying to sleep. Imagine your anxieties not as monsters under the bed, but as geometric shapes. They have a cause. They have dimensions. They have a limit. They are solvable. But while the ethics was being written in the quiet of his room, Spinoza decided to launch a different book into the world, a book that would serve as a shield for the philosophy he was building. He looked at the Dutch Republic around him. It was the most tolerant place in Europe, yes, but the walls were closing in. The strict Calvinist clergy were gaining power. They wanted to censor books. They wanted to ban atheism. Spinoza realized that if he didn't fight for the right to think freely, his ethics would never see the light of day. So in 1670, he paused his geometric masterpiece and published a political pamphlet. He called it the Tractatus Theologico Politicus, Theological Political Treatise. He was smart enough not to put his name on it. The title page simply said it was published in Hamburg. A lie. It was printed in Amsterdam by a fictional publisher. The book was a bombshell. In it, Spinoza argued that the Bible should be read like any other historical document, analyzed for its context, its author, and its intent. He argued that miracles were impossibilities because God's laws are perfect and unchangeable. If God had to break his own laws to do a miracle, that would mean God had made a mistake the first time. But his most dangerous argument was for democracy and freedom of speech. He wrote that the ultimate goal of the state is not to control people, but to liberate them. The true purpose of the state is in fact freedom, he declared. He argued that every person should be allowed to think what they like and say what they think, provided they obey the civil laws. The reaction was immediate and ferocious. The clergy went ballistic. The book was denounced from pulpits across the Netherlands. They called it a book forged in hell by the apostate Jew and the devil. It was banned. Possession of it became a crime. Spinoza watched the storm from his window in Voorburg. He saw the hatred his ideas provoked. He saw his anonymous book being burned or sold under the counter, wrapped in brown paper like pornography. And he made a difficult decision. He opened the drawer of his desk, looked at his beloved Ethics, the book that contained the true cure for all of this anger, and he closed the drawer. He realized he could not publish the Ethics while he was alive. It was too dangerous. If they hated the Tractatus, they would kill him for the Ethics. So, the masterpiece became a secret. It became a samizdat work circulated underground. This adds a layer of poignant intimacy to the text. Imagine Spinoza sitting in his room, copying out sections of the Ethics by hand. He would fold the papers, seal them with wax, and give them to a trusted courier. These packets would travel by barge along the canals to a small circle of friends in Amsterdam. Jarig Gels, a grocer; Lodewijk Meyer, a doctor; Simon de Vries. These friends would gather in a room, lock the door, and read the propositions aloud. Proposition 33. Things could not have been brought into being by God in any manner, or in any order different from that which has in fact obtained. They would discuss it in hushed tones. They were the keepers of the secret. They knew that in this stack of papers lay a vision of total peace, a vision of a universe without fear. For Spinoza, there must have been a profound loneliness in this. A writer wants to be read, a thinker wants to share, but he had to be content with an audience of 5 or 6 people. He had to accept that his life's work would likely only be fully born after his body was in the ground. There is a story that neighbors in Voorburg noticed his reclusive nature. They knew he was writing something, but they didn't know what. They just saw the quiet man who ground lenses by day and wrote by night. They liked him. He was polite. He helped them with their problems. When he walked to the shops to buy his milk and raisins, he would tip his hat. They had no idea that the man buying the milk was currently dismantling the entire theological structure of Western civilization in his spare time. He kept the manuscript safe. He revised it. He polished the logic just as he polished his glass. He removed every unnecessary word. He wanted it to be perfect, impenetrable, a diamond of reason that would survive the fires of censorship. The danger was real. In nearby cities, freethinkers were being arrested. One of his friends, Adrian Korbag, published a book echoing Spinoza's ideas. Korbag was arrested, interrogated, and thrown into a damp dungeon in Amsterdam. He collapsed under the harsh conditions and died a miserable death in prison in 1669. Spinoza mourned Korbag. He saw what happened when you spoke too loudly. He chose silence, not out of cowardice, but out of a desire to protect the work. The ethics was more important than his ego. It had to survive. So he sat in his room, listening to the wind rattle the window panes, and wrote for a future generation for us. He was writing a letter to a world that wasn't ready to receive it yet. And as he wrote, the political situation in the Netherlands was darkening. The Golden Age was losing its shine. The French army was gathering at the border. The mob was getting angry. And soon, the violence that Spinoza had analyzed so coolly in his geometric propositions would spill out onto the streets, right in front of his eyes. In the quiet of his room, amidst the geometric diagrams and the dust of grinding glass, Spinoza finally wrote down 3 words that would become the most dangerous and beautiful equation in the history of philosophy. Deus sive natura. God or nature. It sounds simple, doesn't it? But let those words sink into the silence of the room. With that tiny word, or, sive, Spinoza collapsed the entire vertical hierarchy of the universe into a single, infinite horizontal plane. For thousands of years, humanity had looked up. We looked up to the heavens to find God. We imagined a king sitting on a throne above the clouds, a creator who stood outside of his creation, like a carpenter stands outside the table he has built. This God was powerful, wise, but also terrifyingly human. He got angry. He got jealous. He picked favorites. He demanded praise. He listened to prayers, and sometimes, if he was in a good mood, he answered them. Spinoza looked at this image of God and gently shook his head. He didn't see a king. He saw the universe. He argued that there cannot be 2 things, God and the world. Because if God is infinite, if God is everything, then there is no outside for the world to be in. Therefore, the world must be in God, The world is God. This is the heart of Spinoza's vision. Everything that exists, a swirling nebula in deep space, the crab crawling on the beach, the thought passing through your mind, right? Now the dust mote floating in the sunbeam is made of one single divine substance. He didn't mean nature in the sense of just trees and birds. He meant nature in the sense of reality itself. The laws of physics, the logic of mathematics, the energy that binds the atom, that is God. Imagine the relief of this idea. If God is the universe, then God does not judge you. The ocean does not judge the wave. The sun does not judge the flower. They simply exist according to their nature. Spinoza's God does not get angry when you make a mistake, any more than a triangle gets angry when you draw it poorly. For a man who had been cursed by the synagogue and threatened by the church, this must have been a balm for the soul. It meant that no priest or rabbi could bar him from God. As long as he existed, he was participating in the divine. You cannot be exiled from the universe. You cannot be excommunicated from reality. He wrote about this with a calmness that is almost hypnotic. He described individual human beings not as separate, lonely souls trapped in bodies, but as modes of God. Think of the ocean. It is one vast, deep body of water. But on the surface, the wind whips up waves. Each wave looks different. Some are tall, some are small, some are white-capped. They rise, they travel, and then they crash and disappear. We are the waves. We are temporary shapes taken by the infinite substance. We rise, we live, we express our nature, and then we sink back into the ocean. But the water remains. The substance is eternal. Spinoza invites us to see ourselves this way. When you feel small or lonely or afraid, you are forgetting that you are the water. You are identifying only with the shape of the wave. Subspecie aeternitatis, under the aspect of eternity, you are part of the whole. This idea, dies sive natura, solved the problem of fear. In the 17th century, fear was a constant companion. People feared demons. They feared witchcraft. They feared that if they didn't say the right prayer, God would send a plague or a storm to destroy their village. Spinoza swept all of that away. God does not make miracles, he argued. God acts according to eternal, unchangeable laws. If a storm comes, it is not because God is angry at your sins. It is because high pressure met low pressure, according to the laws of thermodynamics. It is necessary. It is perfect in its own way. There is a profound acceptance in this worldview. It is remarkably similar to the Stoicism of Marcus Aurelius or the Taoism of Lao Tzu. It is the peace that comes from surrendering to the inevitable flow of things. Do not weep. Do not laugh. Understand. However, this was a difficult pill for his contemporaries to swallow. They wanted a father. They wanted someone to listen to their troubles. Spinoza offered them a beautiful, cold, shimmering structure of logic. Scholars and critics have fought for centuries over what to call him. The Romantics, like the poet Novalis, called him a God-intoxicated man. They saw him as a mystic who saw divinity everywhere he looked. They imagined him walking through the Dutch fields, seeing the blooming tulips and the gray sky as the literal body of God. But his enemies called him a dangerous atheist. They said that by making God everything, he had made God nothing. If the mud is God and the stars are God, then the word God loses its holy meaning. So, which was he? Was he the most religious man in Europe, or the most irreligious? Perhaps the answer lies in the lens he ground. To Spinoza, science was worship. When he studied the geometry of light, He wasn't turning away from God. He was studying God's mind. Every new discovery, every mathematical proof, was a hymn of praise to the infinite intelligence of nature. There is a lovely, humanizing detail in how he lived this philosophy. Despite his high-flying ideas, Spinoza was incredibly down-to-earth. He didn't preach on street corners. He lived it in the small things. When his landlady asked him if he wanted a special meal, he would often say no, that simple broth was enough. He didn't need luxury because he found joy in understanding. He would spend hours talking to the simple people of the village, farmers, soldiers, housewives. He didn't talk down to them. He believed that the same divine spark of reason was in everyone. He kept a signet ring used to seal wax on letters. On it was engraved a rose, a play on his name, Spinoza, thorny, and a Latin word, caut. Caut. Be cautious. It was a reminder. The world was not ready to hear that God was the same thing as gravity. The world wanted its myths. And Spinoza knew that stripping away those myths was dangerous work. He was performing open-heart surgery on the Western mind, and the patient might wake up and attack the surgeon. But in the privacy of his attic, late at night, staring out at the stars through a window pane, he might have polished himself. He felt no fear. He felt a cosmic belonging. He knew that the atoms in his body and the light from the stars were dancing to the same silent music of necessity. He was safe in the arms of the machine. But while Spinoza found peace in the eternal laws of nature, the temporary laws of men were breaking down. The year 1672 was approaching, a year the Dutch still call the Rampjaar, the disaster year. The New Jerusalem was about to descend into madness, and the philosopher who believed in the rationality of the universe was about to witness the supreme irrationality of the mob. The calm in the attic was about to be shattered by the screams from the street. The year 1672 is etched into Dutch memory with a name that sounds like a tolling bell: the Rampjaar, the disaster year. If Spinoza had spent his life building a fortress of reason, 1672 was the year the floodwaters of madness slammed against its gates. The Dutch Republic, so wealthy and proud, suddenly found itself besieged on all sides. The French army under Louis XIV invaded from the south, marching almost unopposed towards Amsterdam. The English navy attacked from the sea. German bishops marched from the east. The New Jerusalem was surrounded. Panic is a powerful solvent. It dissolves the thin veneer of civilization in an instant. As the enemy armies approached, the Dutch people didn't blame the invaders. They blamed their leaders. Specifically, they blamed the Grand Pensionary Johann de Witt and his brother Cornelis. Johann de Witt was the most powerful man in the Republic, a brilliant mathematician, and a statesman who embodied the ideals of the Golden Age: tolerance, trade, and Republican liberty. He was also a friend to the free thinkers. While there is no record of Spinoza and de Witt having a close personal friendship, de Witt was the protector of the intellectual climate that allowed men like Spinoza to breathe. He was the philosopher king of the Dutch commercial empire. But the mob wanted a strong man. They wanted a savior. They clamored for the young Prince William of Orange to take power and save them from the French. The Calvinist preachers whipped the crowds into a frenzy, painting de Witt as a traitor, a seller of the country, an enemy of God. Spinoza, from his room in The Hague, he had moved into the city proper by now. Renting rooms on the Paviljoens Gracht, watched the storm gather. He understood the multitude. In his political writings, he had analyzed how fear drives masses of people to surrender their freedom for safety. But understanding the theory of a storm is very different from standing in the rain. On August 20th, 1672, the levees broke. Cornelis de Witt was already in prison in The Hague, falsely accused of plotting to kill the prince. He was tortured. In a display of stoic courage that Spinoza would have admired, Cornelis recited poetry by Horace while his limbs were being crushed, refusing to confess to a crime he didn't commit. His brother Johann came to the prison to visit him, perhaps to take him into exile. A crowd gathered outside the Gevangenpoort prison. It started as a protest, but it grew into a beast. Fueled by alcohol and lies, the mob broke through the gates. They dragged the two brothers out into the street. What happened next is one of the darkest chapters in Dutch history. It was an explosion of primal violence. The two most civilized men in the country were beaten, shot, and stabbed. But the mob wasn't finished. In a frenzy that bordered on ritualistic cannibalism, they stripped the bodies, hung them upside down from a gibbet, and tore them apart. Parts of their bodies were sold as souvenirs. It was a total collapse of humanity. Spinoza heard the roar. The Paviljoensgracht is not far from the prison. The news traveled fast, carried by breathless neighbors and the smell of smoke. When Spinoza heard the details, the torture, the murder, the desecration, something inside him snapped. This is the only time in his entire life that we see the mask of caution slip. The man who wrote that human actions should not be mocked, not lamented, nor execrated, but understood, could not understand this. Or rather, he understood it too well, and he hated it. He collapsed in tears. The grief was overwhelming. It wasn't just the loss of a political ally. It was the shattering of his faith in his fellow citizens. How could human beings, capable of reason, capable of understanding the geometry of God, descend to the level of wolves? In a burst of rare, hot anger, Spinoza sat at his desk. He didn't write a philosophical proposition. He didn't write a geometric proof. He wrote a placard, a poster. On it, he wrote two words in Latin, Ultimi Barbarorum, the ultimate of barbarians. He intended to walk out his front door, march down the street to the place where the mangled bodies of the De Witt brothers were still hanging, and nail this sign to the wall. It was a suicide mission. The mob was still roaming the streets, drunk on blood. If a known atheist Jew had walked up to condemn them, they would have torn him to pieces without hesitation. Spinoza was ready to die to speak this final truth. He wanted to shout his outrage into the face of the chaos. This is the moment where the biography of Spinoza almost ended in 1672, but he was saved by a simple, practical man, his landlord, Hendrik van der Spek. Van der Spek was a painter, not a philosopher, but he had common sense. He saw his lodger putting on his cloak, his eyes red with weeping, clutching the paper in his hand. He knew exactly what would happen. So he did the only sensible thing. He locked the door. He refused to let Spinoza leave the house. He likely stood in front of the door, or perhaps simply turned the key from the outside and pocketed it. "You are not going out there, Mynheer Spinoza," he might have said. "The world has gone mad, and I won't let it take you too." Spinoza raged. He pleaded, but eventually the fire burned down. He was trapped in his room. That night, as the shouts of the Orangist mobs echoed through The Hague, Spinoza sat in the dark. The placard lay on the table, unposted, Ultimi Barbarorum. The barbarians had won the day. This event left a deep scar on Spinoza's later political writing. In his final unfinished book, The Political Treatise, the tone shifts. He is less optimistic than he was in the theological political treatise. He is more realistic about the dangers of the mob. He realizes that reason is a fragile flower that needs to be protected by strong institutions. You cannot just give people freedom and expect them to be good. You have to design a state that channels their passions so they don't destroy each other. The murder of the DeWitts taught him that the state of nature is always lurking just beneath the pavement. Civilization is thin ice. But there is another layer to this trauma. Spinoza had spent years arguing that everything happens according to necessity, that nothing is bad or evil in the eyes of the universe. It just is. How did he reconcile the lynching with his philosophy? Was the murder of the DeWitts necessary? Was it part of God's perfection? Yes, this is the hardest part of Spinozism. He had to swallow the bitter pill of his own logic. He had to accept that the ignorance of the mob, the fear of the crowd, and the violence of that day were all effects of previous causes. The mob acted according to their nature, just as a storm acts according to its nature. To hate them was irrational. To judge them was to misunderstand reality. He had to find a way back to equanimity. He had to grind this terrible event in the lens of his mind until he could see through it without flinching. He had to forgive the unforgivable, not because it was morally right, but because it was factually inevitable. He stayed inside. The days turned into weeks. The Prince of Orange consolidated power. The French were eventually pushed back when the Dutch opened the dikes and flooded the countryside, turning Holland into an island. The water saved the country, and silence saved Spinoza. He went back to his desk. He picked up the pen. He continued to write. But the man who sat there now was a little more weathered, a little more cautious. He had looked into the abyss of human nature, and he knew that his attic room was not just a workshop. It was a lifeboat floating on a dark and stormy ocean. He turned his eyes away from the bloody streets and looked back to the corner of his room, where a spider was spinning a web. He watched it with a new intensity. The predator, the prey, the trap, the quiet violence of nature, playing out in miniature. After the blood on the streets, Spinoza retreated to the corner of his room. The world outside had proven itself to be a chaotic storm of passions, but inside the attic on the pavilion scratch, the universe was still operating with perfect, chilling precision. If you were a guest in Spinoza's room during these final years in The Hague, you might have witnessed a scene that biographers have found both fascinating and slightly disturbing. The philosopher, taking a break from writing about the intellectual love of God, would hunt for a housefly. He would catch it, perhaps with a quick snatch of his glass-polishing hand, and then walk over to a spider's web he had allowed to flourish in the corner or near the window. He would toss the fly into the web. Then he would grab his microscope or a magnifying lens and watch. He would watch the spider rush out from its hiding place. He would watch the struggle, the desperate buzzing of the fly's wings, the methodical wrapping of the silk, the injection of the venom. And sometimes, according to his early biographer Coleris, he would laugh. Now, before you recoil, understand that this wasn't the laughter of a sadist. Spinoza wasn't a cruel boy pulling the wings off butterflies. It was the laughter of recognition. It was the laugh of a scientist who predicts an outcome and sees the experiment verify it perfectly. It was the satisfaction of seeing the ethics played out in miniature. To Spinoza, the spider and the fly were not villains and victims. They were simply two finite modes of God, each driven by the most fundamental law of the universe, conatus. Conatus is a Latin word that means striving or effort. In Spinoza's philosophy, it is the engine of existence. Proposition 6 of Part 3 of the Ethics states, each thing, as far as it can by its own power, strives to persevere in its being. The spider has a conatus to be a spider to eat, to spin, to survive. The fly has a conatus to be a fly, to breed, to escape. When they meet in the web, it is not a moral battle between good and evil. It is simply a collision of two vectors of power. The spider is not bad for eating the fly. It is just being a perfect spider. This observation in the corner of his room was the key to healing the trauma of the Day-Wick murders. When Spinoza watched the mob tear apart the statesman, he was watching a massive human version of the spider and the fly. The mob was driven by fear and a desire for safety, their conatus. The DeWitts were an obstacle to that perceived safety. The collision was violent, tragic, and messy, but in Spinoza's eyes, it was not unnatural. It was as natural as rain. He realized that good and evil are subjective terms we invented. We call things good when they help us persevere, like food, friends, or the sun. We call things bad when they hinder us, like poison, enemies, or the spider's venom. But to the universe, to God, there is no good or bad. There is only is. The venom is just a chemical compound. It is neutral. It only becomes bad when it enters the fly's blood. This might sound cold, specifically when you are lying in bed trying to find comfort. But Spinoza argues that this coldness is actually the ultimate comfort. Think about it. If you believe the universe is judging you, or that there are evil forces out to get you, the world is a scary place. But if you accept that the person who cut you off in traffic, or the boss who is rude to you, is just a mode acting out their nature, driven by their own internal pressures and causes, you stop taking it personally. You stop hating them. You start to understand them, just as you understand the spider. He who understands that everything happens by necessity, Spinoza wrote, is calm. This fascination with the visual aspect of truth extended beyond the microscope. Few people know that Spinoza was also an artist. In his sparse room, amidst the books and the tools, there was a sketchbook. He would draw portraits of his visitors, and sometimes of himself. Only one of these drawings is rumored to have survived, or at least been described in detail before it was lost. It was a self-portrait. But Spinoza didn't draw himself as a philosopher in robes. He drew himself dressed as Masaniello. Masaniello was a Neapolitan fisherman who had led a famous revolt against Spanish rule in 1647. He was a revolutionary, a man of the people who rose up against tyranny. Why would the quiet, polite Spinoza draw himself as a revolutionary fisherman? It was a secret wink to his own nature. Outwardly, he was the polite lens grinder who paid his rent on time and tipped his hat. But inwardly, he was a rebel who was overthrowing the tyranny of superstition. He was leading a revolution of the mind. The drawing was a glimpse into the fire that still burned quietly beneath his cautious exterior. He spent hours sketching. Imagine the scratching of the charcoal on paper, the smell of fixative. It was another way to observe. To draw a face, you have to understand its structure, the bones beneath the skin, the way light hits the cheekbone. It is the same as grinding a lens, the same as writing a proposition. It is all about seeing what is really there, stripped of illusion. His room became a cabinet of curiosities of the mind. He didn't have many possessions when he died. His estate included just 2 pairs of trousers, a few shirts, his bed, and his books. He owned almost nothing, but he possessed the entire universe in his head. He loved to smoke his pipe. The inventory of his belongings lists a rosewood pipe. You can picture him in the evening, the spider web trembling in the draught, the smoke curling around his head. He found tobacco to be a good remedy for the gloom. "I make use of the things of life," he said, "and enjoy them as much as possible, provided it be not to satiety." He wasn't a monk who hated pleasure. He liked good beer. He liked a warm fire. He believed that joy was a transition to a higher state of perfection. The greater the joy we feel, the more we pass to a greater perfection. So he sat there, smoking, drawing, and watching the spiders. But his solitude was never absolute. As the years went by, the spider of The Hague began to attract flies of a different sort. But these weren't victims. They were pilgrims. Despite his excommunication, despite the bans on his books, Spinoza's reputation had spread across Europe. The lens grinder of The Hague became a legend. People whispered that there was a man in Holland who had found the secret to happiness, a man who lived like a saint but believed in no religion. They began to come. Some came to argue. Some came to learn. Some came just to stare at the atheist to see if he had horns. Prince Conde, the commander of the French army that had invaded Holland, invited Spinoza to his camp in Utrecht. Can you imagine the risk? Traveling behind enemy lines to meet the invading general? The mob in The Hague certainly noticed. When Spinoza returned, they whispered that he was a French spy. His landlord feared the house would be stormed again. Spinoza simply said, "If they come to the door, I will go out to them, even if they do to me what they did to the De Witts." He was fearless because he had nothing to lose. But the most interesting visitors were the other great minds of the age. They came wrapped in cloaks, arriving at night to avoid suspicion. They climbed the narrow stairs to the attic. They sat on the simple wooden stools. And in those conversations, amidst the smoke and the dust, the modern world was being forged. The clash of ideas that happened in that room would shape science, politics, and religion for the next 3 centuries. One visitor, in particular, stands out. A young, ambitious, brilliant German philosopher who was everything Spinoza was not a courtier, a diplomat, a man who wanted to be famous. His name was Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, and their meeting would be the ultimate collision of 2 intellectual universes. In November 1676, the attic stairs creaked under the boots of a young man who was, in many ways, Spinoza's shadow self. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz was 30 years old. He was a prodigy, a dandy, a man who wore large wigs and moved effortlessly through the courts of princes. He would go on to invent calculus, independently of Newton, and dream of binary code, the language of computers. But right now, he was on a secret mission to meet the monster of The Hague. Leibniz was fascinated by Spinoza, but he was also terrified of being associated with him. To be a Spinozist was career suicide in the conservative courts of Germany. So Leibniz came quietly. He stayed in The Hague for several days, and he spent hours in Spinoza's room. Imagine the scene. 2 of the greatest intellects in human history, sitting across from each other at a small wooden table. Spinoza, 43 years old, is coughing softly. The glass dust is taking its toll. He is thin, his eyes deep and dark, his demeanor calm and unpretentious. He wears his simple robe. Leibniz is vibrant, ambitious, eager to prove himself. He talks fast. He wants to reconcile science with Orthodox Christianity. He wants to prove that this is the best of all possible worlds, created by a benevolent God who chose it from infinite options. Spinoza listens, packs his pipe, and gently demolishes Leibniz's optimism. There is no choice, Spinoza might have said. God did not choose this world. This world flows from God's nature, as inevitably as the properties of a triangle flow from the definition of a triangle. To say God chose implies God lacked something before. God lacks nothing. Leibniz was shaken. He later wrote that Spinoza's philosophy was hideous and dangerous. He publicly denounced him. But in private, Leibniz was obsessed. Scholars have found that Leibniz's own private notes are full of Spinoza's ideas. He was like a moth drawn to the flame of Spinoza's honesty, even as he tried to build a firewall against it. They talked about ethics. They talked about physics. And then, in a moment of supreme trust, Spinoza did something he rarely did. He opened the drawer. He took out the manuscript of the Ethics. He let Leibniz read it. It was a profound act of vulnerability. He was handing the blueprints of his soul to a man who could easily betray him. And in a way, Leibniz did he borrowed or stole ideas without credit and publicly distanced himself. But in that room, for those few days, there was a connection. Spinoza saw a mind that could grasp the geometry. But Leibniz wasn't the only one. The visitors were becoming a strain. Spinoza's health was failing. The coughing fits were getting worse. He would sometimes have to stay in bed for days, too weak to grind lenses, too weak to write. He knew his time was short. He began to organize his affairs. He was unafraid of death. His entire philosophy was a meditation on how death is just a reconfiguration of substance. But he was afraid for his work. He called his landlord Van der Spik. He gave him strict instructions. "When I die," he said, "do not let the preachers in, and do not let my manuscripts be lost." He pointed to a specific desk. Inside was the Ethics, the political treatise, and his Hebrew grammar. He instructed that upon his death, the desk with the papers inside was to be locked and sent immediately to a bookseller in Amsterdam named Jan Reuverts. He was arranging the escape of his ideas. He knew that once he was dead, the vultures would circle. His sister Rebecca might try to claim his property and burn the heretical papers. The church might try to seize them. He had to ensure that the voice of reason would survive the death of the body. The winter of 1676 to 1677 was hard. The canals froze. The damp cold of the Dutch winter seeped into the bones. Spinoza spent more time in bed. He kept his cheerful demeanor, though. He would come down in the evenings to smoke a pipe with Van der Spik and his wife, asking about the sermon they heard at church, chatting about the neighbors. He never complained about pain. He believed that complaining was a form of passive emotion. It meant you were being acted upon by the world, rather than understanding it. To complain was to lose your freedom. So he suffered in silence, maintaining his conatus, his striving for dignity, until the very end. He was dying of what was likely silicosis, complicated by tuberculosis. The glass dust, the clarity he had inhaled for 20 years, had turned his lungs to stone. It is a tragic, poetic end. The medium of his vision became the instrument of his death. But he kept writing. He was working on the political treatise, trying to sketch out the perfect democracy. He broke off in chapter 11. The sentence is unfinished. The pen stopped not because the thought was complete, but because the hand could no longer hold it. February 21st, 1677. It was a Sunday. The morning broke gray and cold. Spinoza came downstairs. He spoke to the landlord. He felt unwell, he said, but he didn't think it was the end. He asked for some chicken soup. The doctor arrived, a man named Meyer, perhaps his friend Lodewijk Meyer, though records are unclear. He ordered the soup. Spinoza ate it with a good appetite. The Van der Spijk family got ready for church. It was Sunday, after all. They asked Spinoza if he would be all right alone. "Go," he said. "I will be fine." He urged them to go to their service, to participate in the rituals that gave them comfort, even if he didn't believe in them himself. It was his final act of tolerance. The family left. The house was quiet. The only sound was the wind and the shallow, rasping breath of the philosopher in the attic. He was 44 years old. Let us pause the clock on that final Sunday morning. The family has gone to church. The door is latched, and Spinoza is alone in the silence. To understand the gravity of this moment, we must understand the invisible weight that had been pressing on his chest for years. The dust in the lungs was not a sudden affliction. It was a slow, accumulating price for his clarity. For 20 years, Baruch Spinoza had lived in a cloud of silica. Every time he pressed a lens against the iron-grinding pan, microscopic shards of glass were kicked up into the air. In the sunbeams of his attic, they would have sparkled like diamond dust, beautiful but deadly. With every breath, he inhaled the sharp, indigestible grit of his trade. In the 17th century, medicine was still a clumsy art. They called his condition phthisis, or consumption. They often confused it with the plague or blamed it on melancholy humors. But modern physicians, looking back at his symptoms and his profession, see the clinical signs of silicosis, likely complicated by tuberculosis. Imagine the physiology of it. The tiny glass particles settle in the alveoli of the lungs. The body, trying to protect itself, wraps the intruders in scar tissue. Slowly, over decades, the soft, pink sponge of the lung turns into hard, fibrous stone. The capacity to breathe, to take in the spiritus, the breath of life diminishes. There is a cruel and poetic irony here. Spinoza's philosophy was all about spirit, not as a ghost, but as the animating energy of the universe. In Latin, a word for spirit is spiritus, which literally means breath. The very thing he was trying to define was physically being cut off by the medium he used to see the truth. The glass gave him vision, but it stole his breath. He must have felt the tightening for years. The sharp pains in the chest, the dry cough that rattled the windows at night, the fatigue that settled into his bones like lead. But this is where Spinoza the man shines as brightly as Spinoza the philosopher. A lesser man might have become bitter. He might have railed against God for giving him such a brilliant mind and such a failing body. He might have become a hypochondriac, obsessed with tonics and cures. Spinoza did none of that. He treated his illness with the same cool, geometric detachment he applied to everything else. He famously wrote in the Ethics, "A free man thinks of death least of all things," and his wisdom is a meditation not of death, but of life. He lived this proposition. He refused to let the sad passion of fear dominate his final years. When the coughing fits came, he would wait them out, regain his composure, and go back to his work. He didn't want pity. Pity, in his view, was a useless emotion that only increased sorrow. There is a story that in his final months, he would sometimes come down to speak with the Van der Spijk family, and they would notice his pale, gaunt face. He would make a joke about it. He would turn the conversation to the news of the town, or the price of butter. He protected them from his suffering. He wanted his presence to be a source of joy, not a burden. He knew he was fragile. He referred to his health in letters as a shattered vessel, but he was determined to keep the vessel holding water for as long as possible. He experimented with diet rose hip tea, preserves, trying to find things that would soothe the inflammation. But the dust was winning. In the solitude of that attic, he must have confronted the reality of his own decomposition. For a philosopher who argued that the mind and body are the same thing, the decay of the body meant the inevitable flickering of the mind. He knew that when the oxygen stopped reaching the brain, the idea of the body that was Benedictus de Spinoza would dissolve. Did he fear the dark? His philosophy suggests he did not. He believed that the essence of the mind is eternal. The truths he had discovered, the nature of geometry, the logic of God, were not located in his brain cells. They were eternal truths. By understanding them, he had participated in eternity. A part of him that understood 2 + 2 = 4, or the nature of substance, could not die, because truth cannot die. The human mind cannot be absolutely destroyed with the body, he wrote, but there remains of it something which is eternal. So, as he sat there on that Sunday morning, struggling to draw breath through lungs stiffened by glass, he wasn't waiting for judgment. He wasn't waiting for angels. He was simply waiting for the wave to crash back into the ocean. He was a mode of God that had vibrated with intense clarity for 44 years. Now, the vibration was slowing down. The conatus, the striving to persist, was meeting the overwhelming force of nature. The silence in the room deepens. The dust motes that he had inhaled for so long are now dancing in the light around him, indifferent witnesses to the end of the man who had loved them too much. The clock on the wall of the Van der Spik house ticked steadily. Tick, tock, tick, tock. It was the only sound in the room. The afternoon light of February 21st, 1677, was shifting, the weak winter sun beginning its descent over the rooftops of The Hague. Inside the room, the doctor, presumably Lodewijk Meyer, sat by the bed. We do not know exactly what they said to each other in those final hours. Perhaps they spoke of philosophy. Perhaps they sat in comfortable silence. Two men who understood that words are often unnecessary when the end is clear. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, something changed. The rhythm of the breath, which had been labored and rasping for so long, simply paused. There was no gasp. There was no struggle. There was no terrified cry for a priest, no bargaining with God, no sudden vision of angels or demons. For a man who had been branded the greatest heretic in Europe, his death was shockingly, almost disappointingly, ordinary. He slipped out of existence as quietly as a mist evaporating from a canal. When the Van der Spik family returned from church, shaking the cold from their cloaks, they expected to find their lodger resting. They found the doctor standing alone. "He is gone," the doctor likely said. Spinoza lay in his bed, looking as if he were asleep. His face was calm. The storm of passions that he had spent his life analyzing had finally ceased. The waves had settled. The ocean was still. But here, a small, gritty detail of human nature enters the story, a detail Spinoza would have observed with a wry, knowing smile. The doctor, his friend, did not stay to comfort the grieving family. He did not wait to help with the arrangements. Instead, Dr. Meyer looked around the room. He saw a few loose silver ducats on the table money, intended for the week as rent and food. He saw a silver-handled knife, perhaps the one Spinoza used to cut his fruit. The doctor took the money. He took the knife, and he left. He walked out of the house and disappeared into the city, leaving the body of the greatest philosopher of the age alone. It was a final, petty act of greed, a perfect example of what Spinoza called bondage to the emotions. Even at the deathbed of a sage, human beings remain human beings, driven by small, irrational desires. Spinoza would not have been angry. He would have simply noted it as another geometric fact of human nature. Men desire silver. The funeral took place 4 days later, on February 25th, and here lies the final beautiful paradox of Spinoza's life. He was an excommunicated Jew. He was a hated atheist in the eyes of the Calvinist Church. By all rights, he should have been buried in a pauper's grave or in unconsecrated ground, scorned by society. But on that Tuesday, the streets of The Hague were filled with carriages. 6 coaches followed his coffin. A long train of illustrious persons, wealthy merchants, scholars, perhaps even secret envoys from foreign courts, walked behind the hearse. The simple lens grinder was carried to the new church, Nieuwe Kerk, on the Spui. He was buried inside the church in a rented grave. The Christian earth welcomed the Jewish heretic. The soil didn't care about his theology. The grave was marked simply. Later, unfortunately, because the grave was only rented, a common practice then, his remains were eventually cleared out to make room for others. His bones were scattered, mixed with the dust of thousands of nameless citizens. In a way, this was the perfect ending. Spinoza didn't believe in the resurrection of the body. He didn't believe in shrines. He believed that matter is constantly recycled, constantly changing form. His carbon, his calcium, the atoms that made up his brain, they simply flowed back into the great substance of the universe. He became the grass, the rain, the stone. Back in the attic room, the landlord began to clean up. It was a meager inventory. They found his clothes, 2 pairs of trousers, 7 shirts, a few handkerchiefs. They found his bed, his grinding tools, and his desk. And inside the desk, they found the treasure. The landlord, faithful to his promise, locked the desk. He didn't read the papers. He didn't sell them to the highest bidder. He arranged for the heavy wooden box to be placed on a barge bound for Amsterdam, to the bookseller Jan Rieverts. Imagine that barge drifting slowly down the canal at night. The water is black and still. The box sits on the deck, covered by a tarp. Inside that box is the manuscript of the Ethics. Inside that box is the explosive idea that God is nature, that we are born free, and that happiness is not a reward for virtue, but is virtue itself. The ideas were escaping. The body was dead, but the mind of Benedictus de Spinoza was just beginning its journey. The silence of the attic was about to be broken by the printing press. And while the preachers would rage and the kings would ban the book, they were too late. You cannot unthink a thought. You cannot put the light back into the sun. Spinoza had done his work. He had ground the lens. Now, he left it for us to look through. The barge carrying the wooden desk arrived in Amsterdam. It was unloaded onto the damp cobblestones, perhaps under the cover of a gray, rainy twilight. The bookseller, Jan Rieverts, knew exactly what he had to do. He had his orders. Rieverts was a brave man. In the 17th century, printing a banned book wasn't just a business risk. It was a physical danger. You could be fined, imprisoned, or your shop could be shuttered by the authorities. But Rieverts belonged to that underground brotherhood of free thinkers who believed the truth was worth the risk. He worked quickly. He gathered the handwritten manuscripts, the ethics, the unfinished political treatise, the letters. He set the type. The heavy iron press clanked and hissed, smelling of oil and lampblack. In late 1677, just months after the philosopher's death, a book appeared in the shops. It was titled simply BDS, Opera Posthuma. The author's name was not spelled out, just the initials, BDS, Benedictus de Spinoza. Even from the grave, He was practicing court caution, but everyone knew who it was. And the reaction was an explosion of outrage that shook the foundations of Europe. The Dutch States General banned the book almost immediately. They called it profane, atheistic, and blasphemous. The Catholic Church placed it on the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the list of forbidden books. Preachers thundered that this Jew of Amsterdam was trying to destroy all religion, all morality, and all government. But here is the thing about forbidden books. They are irresistible. The ban didn't stop the ideas. It just drove them underground. The opera posthuma became the most dangerous, coveted object in the intellectual world. It was smuggled in the false bottoms of trunks. It was read behind locked doors in Paris, London, and Berlin. It was whispered about in the salons of the Enlightenment. Spinoza became the architect of modernity, but he was an invisible architect. He drew the blueprints for the world we live in today, but for centuries, no one dared to put his name on the building. Think about the world you live in right now. You are likely listening to this story in a room where you feel safe. You can believe whatever you want about God, or believe nothing at all, and no secret police will knock on your door. You can criticize your political leaders without being tortured. You assume that the government exists to serve you, not the other way around. These ideas feel normal to us, like the air we breathe. But in 1677, they were radical, terrifying hallucinations. And they came, in large part, from the mind of the lens grinder. Spinoza was the first major European thinker to argue unequivocally for the separation of church and state. In his theological political treatise, he looked at the bloody history of religious wars and concluded that as long as priests have political power, there will be no peace. He argued that religion should be a private matter, a matter of personal piety and love for one's neighbor. It should have no teeth in the courtroom. The state should control the church, not the other way around. This was a shocking inversion of the medieval world order. But he went further. He invented the modern concept of secular democracy. Before Spinoza, most philosophers, like Thomas Hobbes, argued that we need strong kings because humans are naturally wicked. Without a king to terrify us, we would tear each other apart. Spinoza disagreed. He looked at the spider and the fly. He looked at the geometry of human nature, and he saw something else. He saw that the ultimate goal of human life is to express our power, to understand, to flourish. He wrote a sentence that should be carved in stone above every parliament building in the world. The ultimate design of the state is not to dominate men, but to free each man from fear, that he may live and act with full security. The end of the state is really liberty, libertas, liberty. He didn't mean the liberty to do whatever you want, like steal or kill. He meant the liberty to think. He meant the freedom to use your mind without fear. He argued that a government that tries to control people's minds is a tyrannical absurdity, because thoughts cannot be controlled by force. You can chain a man's body, but you cannot chain his reason. These ideas seeped into the groundwater of Western civilization. Scholar Jonathan Israel has argued that there were actually two enlightenments. There was the moderate enlightenment of people like John Locke and Voltaire, who wanted to reform the system but keep a little bit of the old religion and monarchy, just to be safe. And then there was the radical enlightenment. This was the Spinoza stream. This was the stream that wanted full democracy, full equality, full freedom of speech, and a completely secular society. For a long time, Spinoza was the boogeyman. Thinkers like John Locke read him, used his arguments for toleration, but were careful never to cite him. He was radioactive. To be called a Spinozist was an insult, but slowly the ghost prevailed. When Thomas Jefferson sat down to write the American Declaration of Independence, when he wrote about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, he was channeling the spirit of the radical Enlightenment. When the French revolutionaries stormed the Bastille, they were acting on the idea that sovereignty belongs to the people, an idea Spinoza had mathematically proven a century earlier. Spinoza is the silent giant holding up the floorboards of the modern world. Every time you vote, every time you read a newspaper that criticizes the government, every time you choose your own path in life without asking a priest for permission, you are walking in the footsteps of the man who died alone in an attic in The Hague. But Spinoza's legacy isn't just political. It is deeply personal. It is about the geometry of happiness. He taught the modern world that we don't need to be afraid of ourselves. For centuries, the church had taught that human emotions were sinful, that lust, pride, and anger were demons to be whipped out of us. Spinoza said, "No, they are not demons. They are data." He was the first psychologist. He told us to look at our emotions with curiosity. Why am I angry? What is the cause? Oh, I see. I am angry because I fear losing something I love. By understanding the mechanism, we gain power over it. This is the root of modern therapy. Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, admitted that he had a timid dependence on Spinoza. He knew that the lens grinder had mapped the unconscious mind 200 years before him. There is something incredibly soothing about this legacy. We often feel like the world is chaotic, that modernity is a confusing mess of noise and conflict. But Spinoza reminds us that beneath the noise, there is a structure. There is a logic. He built a house of reason for us to live in. It is a house with large windows, clear, polished windows that let in the light of the natural world. He swept out the ghosts and the superstitions. He told us we don't have to be afraid of the dark, because the dark is just part of nature too. As the 18th century turned into the 19th, the ban on his name began to lift. The German romantics Goethe, Hegel, Schelling rediscovered him. They were stunned by the beauty of his system. Goethe, the great poet, carried the ethics in his pocket for a year. He said Spinoza was the only philosopher who calmed his soul. They realized that this atheist was actually a man of profound spiritual depth. He hadn't destroyed God. He had just made God too big to fit inside a church. So tonight, as you lie in the safety of your room, remember that you are a citizen of Spinoza's republic. You are safe from the Inquisition, because a man in a dusty robe dared to write that fear is a bad tool for government. You are free to drift into sleep, free to dream your own dreams, because he proved that your mind belongs to you alone, and that no king or bishop has the key to unlock it. He ground the lens. We are just looking through it. But there is one final connection to make. A connection to a man who lived centuries later, a man with wild hair and a playful smile, who would take Spinoza's vision of a geometric God and use it to unlock the energy of the stars. In 1929, a panic seized the religious leaders of New York. A rumor had spread that the most famous man in the world, the physicist Albert Einstein, was an atheist. A frantic telegram was sent to Einstein's office in Berlin by Rabbi Herbert S. Goldstein. It contained just 5 desperate words. Do you believe in God? Stop. Einstein, usually annoyed by such questions, didn't hesitate. He wired back a sentence that has since become the most famous definition of religion for the scientific age. He didn't quote the Bible. He didn't quote the Talmud. He reached back 300 years into the dusty attic of The Hague. I believe in Spinoza's God, who reveals himself in the lawful harmony of the world, not in a God who concerns himself with the fate and the doings of mankind. With that telegram, the lens grinder and the physicist were linked forever. It is not hard to see why Einstein fell in love with Spinoza. They were soulmates across time. Both were solitary men who preferred the company of equations to the company of people. Both were Jewish heretics. Einstein was secular, Spinoza excommunicated, who were nevertheless possessed by a deep, vibrating sense of the holy. Einstein kept a portrait of Spinoza on the wall of his study. He often spoke of him with the affection one reserves for a grandfather. He even wrote a poem about him, praising how Spinoza found God not in rituals, but in the eternal laws. For Einstein, Spinoza was the only philosopher who truly understood the job of a scientist. Think about what a scientist does. A scientist looks at the chaos of the world, the apples falling, the planets spinning, the light bending, and assumes, with a kind of religious faith, that there is an order underneath it all. They assume that the universe isn't making things up as it goes along. They assume there is a logic. This is Spinoza's substance. When Einstein came up with the theory of relativity, he wasn't trying to invent a clever trick. He was trying to read the mind of God. He wanted to see the geometry that holds space and time together. And when he founded E equals mc, it had the same elegant, inevitable beauty as one of Spinoza's propositions. But there was a deeper, more stubborn connection between them. They both hated the idea of dice. In the 1920s, quantum mechanics was being born. Physicists like Niels Bohr and Heisenberg were discovering that at the atomic level, the world seems to be random. An electron is here, or maybe there. You can only predict the probability, not the certainty. Einstein hated this. He fought against it with every fiber of his being. He famously shouted, "God does not play dice with the universe." Why was he so sure? Because he was a Spinozist. Spinoza taught that everything flows from necessity. If the universe is perfect, it cannot be random. Randomness implies a glitch. It implies that God blinked. Einstein couldn't accept a God who blinked. He wanted the smooth, continuous, deterministic universe that Spinoza had polished in his mind. In the end, modern physics, quantum mechanics, has largely proven that dice do exist, and that Spinoza and Einstein were perhaps too rigid in their demand for order. But the spirit of their quest remains the driving force of science. The dream of a theory of everything, a single equation that explains gravity, electromagnetism, and time is simply the modern name for Spinoza's substance. It is the search for the one thing from which everything else flows. But Spinoza's influence goes beyond physics. It reaches into the soft tissue of our brains. For centuries, Western philosophy, following Descartes, treated the mind and the body as two different things. The body was a machine. The mind was a ghost floating inside it. This dualism caused endless problems. It made us treat our bodies like meat to be disciplined, and our minds like angels to be exalted. It separated emotion from reason. But in the late 20th century, neuroscientists like Antonio Damasio began to look at the brain scans of people with emotional damage. They found something that stunned them. People who couldn't feel emotions couldn't make rational decisions. They couldn't choose what to eat or when to schedule an appointment. Reason needs emotion. The mind is the body. Damasio realized that Spinoza had figured this out in the 1660s. Spinoza argued that the mind is simply the idea of the body. When your body is doing well, flourishing, your mind feels joy. When your body is doing poorly, struggling, your mind feels sorrow. Thinking is just the biological process of mapping the world. Damasio wrote a famous book called Looking for Spinoza. He argued that Spinoza is the true prophet of modern neuroscience. He taught us that we are biological organisms striving to persist, and that our highest spiritual feelings are rooted in our flesh and blood. This is a deeply healing idea. It means you don't have to fight your body to be a good person. You don't have to suppress your nature. You just have to understand it. When you feel anxious or sad or angry, Spinoza whispers, listen to the data. Your body is telling you something about your environment. Don't judge it. Decode it. There is a beautiful story about Einstein visiting the Regensburg cottage where Spinoza lived. He signed the guest book. He walked into the small room where the grinding bench stood. He stood there for a long time, silent. What was he thinking? Perhaps he was thinking about the courage it took to sit in this room 300 years earlier and dismantle the medieval world with nothing but a pen. Perhaps he was thinking about how lonely it is to see a truth that no one else can see. Or perhaps he was just feeling the amor Dei intellectualis, the intellectual love of God. This was Spinoza's final promise to us. He said that when we finally understand the universe, when we see the chain of causes, when we see how we fit into the big picture, we don't just feel smart. We feel love, not the romantic love of Romeo and Juliet, not the needy love of a child for a parent, but a cool, steady, overwhelming sense of awe. It is the feeling you get when you stand on a mountaintop and look at the galaxy. You feel small, yes, but you also feel infinite, because you are part of the view. Einstein called it cosmic religious feeling. He said it was the strongest and noblest motive for scientific research. Spinoza taught us that we don't need miracles to feel awe. The fact that water freezes at 0 degrees is a miracle. The fact that the moon pulls the tides is a miracle. The fact that you are lying here, breathing, your heart beating in rhythm with the laws of chemistry that were forged in the Big Bang, that is the miracle. You are not an accident. You are a necessary geometry of the universe. As we move toward the final moments of our story, let us hold on to this feeling. The connection between the lens grinder and the physicist reminds us that the search for truth is a long relay race. Spinoza handed the baton to Einstein. Einstein handed it to the future. And now, the baton is in your hands, or rather in your mind, as you drift towards sleep. You are part of this same substance. You are made of the same star stuff. The universe is vast and cold and silent, but it is not empty. It is full of God, and because you are here, you are full of God too. We have traveled a long way tonight. We have walked the bustling docks of 17th century Amsterdam, smelled the spices of the Golden Age, stood in the shadows of the synagogue, and sat in the dusty attic where the universe was taken apart and put back together. Now, as our journey comes to its end, I want to take you back to that room one last time. At this time, the grinding wheel is silent. The books are closed. The pen has been laid down. The smoke from the pipe has long since drifted out the window and dissolved into the cool night air. The room is empty, yet it is full. In the final pages of the Ethics, Spinoza wrote a sentence that serves as a kind of benediction for the weary mind. After leading us through the geometry of emotions, after proving that we are often slaves to our passions, he offers the key to freedom. He doesn't promise a heaven with golden gates. He promises something better. He promises peace. He calls it acquiescentia in se ipso. It translates as repose in oneself, or self-contentment. It is the deep, unshakable satisfaction that comes from knowing you are exactly where you are supposed to be. It is the feeling that you don't need to be richer or smarter or more famous to be worthy of existence. You exist. That is enough. By existing, you are participating in the divine perfection of nature. Spinoza writes, "We feel and experience that we are eternal. Sentimus experimerc nos eternos esse." He doesn't mean that your body will live forever. He knows the body is dust. He means that the truth of who you are, the unique essence that makes you you, is a permanent part of the fabric of reality. You are a verse in the eternal poem of the universe. Even when the verse is finished, the poem remembers it. The page retains the impression. As you lie here tonight, think about how comforting that is. We spend so much of our lives rushing, worrying about the future, regretting the past. We live in duration. Tick, tock, tick, tock. We are obsessed with time. But Spinoza invites you to step out of time. He asks you to look at your life, sub specie aeternitatis, under the aspect of eternity. Imagine just for a moment that you can float up above the timeline of your life. See your worries for what they are, tiny ripples on a vast ocean. They rise, they fall, they pass. They are necessary, perhaps, but they are not you. You are the water. You are the substance that remains. In this state of eternity, there is no pressure. There is no deadline. There is only the silent, glowing presence of what is. Spinoza's life was not easy. He faced exile, loneliness, sickness, and hatred. He had every reason to be bitter, but he died calm. He died with a gladness that confused his enemies. He found the eye of the hurricane. He realized that the storm is just nature doing what nature does, but the mind can build a sanctuary that the storm cannot touch. He built that sanctuary out of reason, but you can build it out of rest. Tonight, you don't have to grind the lens. You don't have to write the book. You don't have to solve the equation. The geometry of the universe is holding you up. The laws of gravity that press you into your mattress are the hands of God. The air you breathe is the spiritus of nature. You are safe in the great machine. The attic is dark now. The spider in the corner sleeps. The dust motes have settled on the floorboards, waiting for the morning sun that will not find the philosopher there. But the light still comes. It pours through the window, bending through the glass, hitting the wall in a perfect focused circle. The man is gone, but the light remains, and the lens remains, and you, listening to this, you are the light. You are the lens. You are the universe observing itself, understanding itself, loving itself. Let go of the name you call yourself. Let go of the story of your day. Sink back into the ocean of substance. You are home. Word count, 750, wind down, and so. We leave the quiet streets of The Hague. We leave the canals reflecting the moon, the windmills standing silent sentinel over the flat, dark fields. The history books are closed. The arguments are finished. Bring your attention back to the here and now. Feel the weight of your body resting. Feel the gentle rise and fall of your chest, that simple rhythmic tide that connects you to every living thing that has ever breathed. Spinoza taught us that everything in nature strives to persevere. But tonight, your striving is done. Your only task now is to surrender. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Let your jaw unclench. Let the tiny muscles around your eyes, the eyes that see the world, soften and smooth out. Imagine a wave of heavy, warm relaxation washing over you, starting at the crown of your head and flowing down through your neck, your arms, your chest. down through your hips, your legs, all the way to your feet. You are a finite mode of an infinite universe, drifting in the vast, safe silence of eternity. There are no questions left to ask tonight. There is only the peace of understanding. There is only the quiet of the stars. Drift, float, sleep. You are safe. You are held. You are eternal.